Welcome to Nightfall History. Tonight, we drift back to where it all began, the world's first dawn in the land between two rivers. The world begins not with noise, but with the soft hush of water moving through reeds. In the dim blue of dawn, the rivers of Mesopotamia, the Tigris and the Euphrates, breathe mist into the air. Their channels twist through fields of wet earth, carrying the scent of clay and salt. This is where the story of civilization awakens, not in a single moment, but in the slow rhythm of rising light. The first horizon is both literal and eternal. It belongs to the marshlands of southern Iraq, around 6,000 years ago, where people began to build more than homes. They began to build memory. Villages that once followed the cycles of flood and harvest took root along these life-giving waters. Clay became the canvas of permanence, molded into walls, vessels, and foundations. Each step from mud to brick was a quiet triumph, a declaration that humanity sought not only to survive, but to remain. Here, the earliest cities emerged: Eridu, Uruk, and Ur. They were small at first, clusters of dwellings encircling a central temple. Yet even in their simplicity, they carried the weight of meaning. For the Sumerians, every brick had spirit, every wall a purpose. When they built, they did not merely shape matter, they participated in the divine act of creation. Through these first cities, the boundary between human and sacred began to dissolve. A temple was not only a house of prayer, it was a link between heaven and earth. Smoke from offerings rose through the air like messages to the stars. The gods were near, dwelling not above the sky but within the city itself, inhabiting its heart. Among these gods were the Anunnaki, ancient and enigmatic. Their name would echo through millennia, carried on the winds of mythology. In Sumerian belief, the Anunnaki were not distant watchers, but participants in the unfolding of existence. They formed the great assembly of heaven and earth, the divine council that decreed the fates of gods and men alike. Each city honored a different aspect of their vast and interwoven order. Enki, lord of the deep waters, was the patron of Eridu, the city of beginnings. Enlil, the storm lord, ruled the air and destiny from Nippur. Inanna, radiant and fierce, embodied love, war, and the untamed brilliance of life itself. Together, they formed the pantheon that gave structure to the universe, and in their stories lay the first blueprint of civilization. As the morning sun rose higher, light poured over the ziggurats, stepped temples built from baked clay. They gleamed like mountains of gold dusted by the dawn. To the Sumerians, these towers were more than monuments. They were stairways, points of communion between the mortal and divine. The Anunnaki, it was said, descended upon them to hear prayers and to bless the people below. In this world, to build upward was to hope, to stretch the finite toward the infinite. Archaeologists excavating ancient Eridu found more than 17 layers of temples, built one atop another, each new shrine rising from the remnants of the last. This unbroken layering tells a story of devotion across centuries, as if the people of Sumer believed that every generation could reach a little closer to the heavens than the one before. Life here followed the pulse of the rivers. The floods brought both promise and peril. When waters rose too high, they swallowed fields and homes. When they fell, they left behind fertile soil that shimmered under the sun. Survival required balance, a lesson the Sumerians wove into their myths. They saw the world not as chaos to be conquered, but as harmony to be maintained. Every harvest, every festival, every song reflected the fragile peace between humankind and the divine forces that sustained them. In this early landscape, imagination was as vital as irrigation. The people of the South looked to the stars, tracing order in their motion. They believed the heavens mirrored the earth, that the same precision guiding the stars also guided the affairs of men. From this cosmic reflection, time itself was born. The calendar, measured by the moon cycles, became humanity's first shared heartbeat. As civilization grew, so did the desire to name. The Sumerians gave names not only to rivers and stars, but to principles, emotions, and natural phenomena. To name was to understand, and to understand was to bring the world into harmony. The Anunnaki, too, were given names and stories not to control them but to connect with them. Through language, myth became memory, and memory became the foundation of culture. Among the oldest tablets ever found, small rectangles of clay etched with careful marks, are lists of offerings to the gods. Each name, each number, represents a moment of reverence preserved in earth. It is one of humanity's first written acts. Not a record of conquest, but of gratitude. To stand in ancient Eridu would have been to witness a world both simple and immense. Fishermen cast nets along the marshes while priests kindled fires at dawn. Children played beside the canals, their laughter mingling with the chants of temple rituals. In the evenings, the city glowed with torchlight, and songs rose to greet the stars. These songs told of the Anunnaki who had shaped the world, beings of immense wisdom and power, yet bound by the same cycles of order that governed all existence. The Anunnaki were said to dwell in the deep, beneath the earth and beneath the sky. From there they watched the balance of life, ensuring that no force grew beyond its destined measure. To the Sumerians, they were not cruel gods, but reminders of cosmic symmetry. They embodied the truth that everything, power, harvest, even joy, must remain in balance. Their stories were not merely legends. They were guides for living. The myth of creation, in which heaven and earth are separated from the primordial waters, reflected the very act of cultivation, of bringing form to chaos. Each retelling was both history and prayer. Through narrative, the Sumerians kept their world intact. The oldest known temple hymns, composed over 4,000 years ago, are attributed to a high priestess named Enheduanna, the daughter of Sargon of Akkad. In her verses, the Anunnaki are praised not for their wrath, but for their justice and compassion. Her voice, preserved in clay, is humanity's first recorded author, and her words still echo the serenity of devotion. As the centuries passed, the people of Sumer learned to live within their own creation. Canals spread like veins through the land, carrying water and sustenance. Trade routes connected city to city, each with its own god, its own temple, its own dialect of faith. But beneath this diversity ran a shared rhythm, a belief that the universe was alive, aware, and benevolent when honored with respect. In the evenings, as the air cooled and shadows lengthened across the ziggurat steps, priests would ascend to perform sacred rituals. They poured offerings of oil and wine, whispered invocations, and watched the first stars appear. Each flicker of light above mirrored a spark of fire below, symbolizing unity between the celestial and the earthly. The Anunnaki were thought to listen, unseen but ever present, the eternal witnesses of humankind's unfolding journey. To imagine that moment is to feel a strange closeness across time. We too look to the same stars. The constellations they mapped are the ones we still name. The questions they asked of origin, of meaning, of connection remain our own. Civilization began, in part, as an answer to silence, the desire to turn wonder into understanding. And so, beneath that first horizon, humanity's story began, with rivers, with stars, with the soft breath of belief. The Anunnaki were born from this interplay between nature and imagination, between fear and gratitude. They were not simply gods of power. They were embodiments of order, of continuity, of the mysterious intelligence within all things. As we drift from this dawn of creation, we carry with us a deeper calm, the awareness that the first civilizations were not built from ambition alone, but from reverence, a quiet wish to belong within the vastness of the cosmos. As the rivers gave life to the fields, so too did belief give shape to the heavens. And from this sacred union of earth and sky, the Anunnaki rose, guardians of balance, keepers of the world's eternal rhythm. The dawn of belief deepens. Where once the Sumerians saw divinity in the waters and the wind, they now sought to understand the design that lay beneath it all. A structure vast and invisible, a pattern that bound heaven, earth, and the underworld together. In this quiet realization, religion became more than reverence. It became a reflection of the cosmos itself. The world, they believed, was not chaos. It was a carefully ordered realm born from a sacred union. Above all things stood An, the god of the sky, infinite, remote, unshaken. Below lay Ki, the fertile earth. From their union came the first generation of divine beings. The Anunnaki, the great assembly of gods who governed existence. Through them, the Sumerians explained everything, from the movement of clouds to the laws of kingship, from the cycles of the moon to the measure of a man's heart. In this early cosmology, nothing was accidental. The universe was seen as a great household, and the Anunnaki were its stewards, each with a duty, a place, and a purpose. The heavens were a realm of counsel, not of distance. The gods debated, judged, and decreed in solemn order, their decisions rippling through the mortal world below. When a storm struck or a harvest failed, it was not random. It was the result of balance shifting in the divine court. To the Sumerians, this order was not oppressive. It was comforting. It gave shape to uncertainty. In a world where floods could erase villages and droughts could starve fields, the belief in divine design made existence feel purposeful. Through ritual, humankind could speak to this cosmic structure, harmonize with it, and, in moments of grace, influence it. Each prayer, each offering, was not an act of fear but of participation, a reaffirmation that humanity belonged within the eternal rhythm of the gods. The Anunnaki were countless, yet they moved as one body. Each carried a domain: sky, wind, water, fertility, wisdom, love, and death, and together they embodied the totality of life. Among them stood the triad that ruled the cosmic balance: Anu, the father of the gods and guardian of the heavens; Enlil, lord of air and authority, who governed destiny; and Enki, god of the waters and of wisdom, the silent craftsman who shaped the world's order from beneath the earth. Anu was distant, a symbol of divine constancy. Enlil was motion, the breath between heaven and earth, the unseen force of decision. Enki was fluidity, the whispering intelligence that moved beneath creation's surface. In their interplay lay a subtle truth, that existence itself required both rule and compassion, both command and understanding. This vision of divine order mirrored human life. Just as the gods held council above, the rulers of cities held court below. The ziggurat became a reflection of heaven's hierarchy, tiered, ascending, each level representing a passage between worlds. The priest who entered its inner sanctum did not simply serve the gods. He reenacted their eternal structure. Through ritual precision, humanity repeated the creation of the world every day, sustaining its balance through ceremony. When the Sumerians inscribed their myths upon clay tablets, they did not see them as mere stories. These were truths beyond question, the architecture of being itself. The myth known as the Enuma Elish, though recorded later in Babylon, carries the same spirit: the triumph of order over chaos, the birth of the cosmos through divine purpose. Within its verses, the Anunnaki are not only witnesses but participants, each god contributing to the foundation of the world's stability. Yet there is a gentle paradox in these tales. Even as they celebrate order, they remind us that balance must be continually renewed. The gods themselves are bound by the laws they create. Power without restraint leads to disruption. Wisdom without action leads to stagnation. In these lessons, one can sense an early philosophical understanding that harmony is not a state but a practice. The Anunnaki were often depicted as judges of the underworld, the realm beneath the living world. To them, even death was part of the pattern, not a punishment. Souls did not vanish. They entered the shadowed halls where divine order extended beyond life. Offerings to the dead, libations poured, bread broken, were acts of remembrance that maintained connection between realms. Every gesture reinforced the invisible lattice of existence. It was through this deep belief in correspondence between heaven and earth, between divine and human, that civilization itself matured. Law, architecture, agriculture, and writing all emerged as reflections of divine order. To irrigate a field was to emulate Enki's wisdom. To govern a city was to channel Enlil's authority. Every act of creation mirrored the gods' original labor, carried out not in imitation but in devotion. The rhythm of life followed sacred measures. The days were divided by celestial observation, the months by lunar cycles, the years by the movement of constellations. Festivals marked the turning points of the sun, each celebration an echo of divine events. When the harvest was brought in, it was offered first to the Anunnaki, for it was they who had set the grain's growth in motion. In this ritualized harmony, humanity and divinity were inseparable. The more the Sumerians sought to understand their gods, the more they saw themselves reflected within them. Their myths became moral as well as cosmic. Stories like that of Enki and Ninhursag spoke of compassion and restoration, the healing of imbalance. Others, like the descent of Inanna, illuminated the inevitability of death and renewal. Through narrative, they transformed divine mystery into human meaning. Each retelling carried with it a soft humility, a recognition that even the gods were not absolute. They too could err, could mourn, could be moved to mercy. The Anunnaki were powerful but not beyond empathy. And in this recognition lay a quiet kind of humanism, the understanding that divinity itself contained the same contradictions that define us. Archaeological traces give voice to this ancient spirituality. Temple tablets record offerings to dozens of deities, each name inscribed with precision. Altars, vessels, and carved figurines all reveal a culture that saw sacredness in every act of daily life. Even the tools of labor were blessed before use, ensuring alignment with the divine rhythm. Theirs was a theology of integration, no boundary between the spiritual and the practical. To modern eyes, this world may seem distant, yet its spirit endures in ways we seldom notice. The very idea of law as higher than the ruler, of the cosmos as ordered and intelligible, traces its ancestry here, to the belief that the universe is governed by balance. From these first visions of the Anunnaki came the seeds of philosophy, of ethics, of the search for harmony that still guides us. The birth of divine order was not the invention of gods, but the recognition of relationship, between power and care, creation and decay, life and the quiet that follows. The Sumerians did not imagine the universe as ruled by fear, but as held together by duty and reverence. To live rightly was to honor that duty. To forget it was to invite chaos back into the world. And so, the early cities became living reflections of the heavens. Every temple courtyard mirrored the firmament. Every offering renewed creation. The people of Sumer believed that, by keeping faith with the Anunnaki, they helped sustain the world itself. Theirs was not a passive worship, it was a partnership, fragile and enduring, between the mortal and the eternal. Even now, when we gaze upon the remains of their temples or read the impressions left on clay, we are witnessing the architecture of belief. The alignment of their cities with celestial points, the careful orientation of their ziggurats, all speak to a vision in which human life followed the same geometry as the stars. It is the first great symphony of civilization, a harmony written in mudbrick and myth. The Anunnaki's presence was everywhere. In wind and water, in the grain of the fields, in the pulse of the human heart. They did not command worship through terror, but through awe, the kind that invites stillness rather than submission. For the Sumerians, to live under divine order was to live in awareness, to recognize the quiet dialogue between heaven and earth. And as the centuries unfolded, that dialogue deepened, carried by kings and priests, by artisans and poets, by generations who built their world upon the foundation first laid beneath the ancient horizon. From this foundation would rise the first empires, the first codes of law, and the enduring stories that continue to shape how humanity understands its place in the cosmos. As agriculture reshaped the land and temples mirrored the heavens, so too did the first rulers emerge, seeking order in the growing complexity of life. And in their search for meaning, the divine council of the Anunnaki would find reflection in the councils of kings. At the edge of the southern marshlands, where the rivers of Tigris and Euphrates begin to breathe into the sea, there once stood a city older than any other, Eridu. To later Sumerians, this was no ordinary settlement. It was the first place where heaven touched earth, where the divine pattern found its home among humankind. They called it the City of the Deep, for it was said to rest upon the watery foundations ruled by Enki, the god of wisdom and subterranean waters. Eridu, in myth and memory, was not merely a beginning, it was the cradle of order made manifest. Its origins stretch back to around 5400 BCE, a time when scattered villages dotted the fertile lowlands, each living by the rhythm of the rivers. Yet here, near the Persian Gulf, something changed. People gathered not only to survive, but to build continuity. They raised temples upon layered mounds, each structure resting on the remains of those before, as if renewing creation itself through clay and devotion. Archaeologists have uncovered more than 18 successive temples at Eridu, each built over the ruins of the previous one. The earliest were modest shrines, barely large enough for a single priest to stand within. But with each generation they grew in size, in intricacy, and in the symbolism they carried. The act of rebuilding itself became sacred, a reminder that civilization, like faith, was a layering of memory over time. To stand in Eridu was to stand within a living metaphor, the meeting of earth and water, of human hands and divine intention. In the Sumerian worldview, Enki, also called Ea in later Akkadian, was the god of wisdom, crafts, and the sweet waters that nourished life. Beneath the soil, he was imagined to dwell in the Abzu, the vast subterranean ocean from which all life flowed. It was here, in his city of Eridu, that Enki was believed to have established the first temple, the Iabzu, House of the Deep Waters. Within its walls, water and spirit intertwined. Priests poured libations into the ground, symbolically returning what had been drawn from the depths. The world above mirrored the world below. The canals surrounding Eridu reflected the constellations in the night sky, the gentle lights of the city shimmering like stars upon the marshes. The Sumerians saw in this alignment the living expression of cosmic symmetry, the same order first born among the Anunnaki now replicated in mudbrick and faith. As settlements flourished along the river plains, Eridu's influence spread quietly, not through conquest, but through imitation. Other towns began to model their temples and rituals upon its example. From Ur to Uruk, from Lagash to Nippur, the architectural and spiritual patterns that began here would define Sumerian civilization for millennia. Eridu became both memory and blueprint, a mythic origin that no later city could surpass in sanctity. Within its precincts, daily life followed sacred rhythm. The priests tended fires that symbolized the eternal flame of creation. Fishermen cast nets into the rivers at dawn, offering the first catch to Enki before bringing the rest to market. Craftsmen worked with reed and clay, their tools seen as gifts of divine intelligence. Every gesture, no matter how small, was thought to echo the work of the gods in forming the world. To the people of Eridu, water was more than a resource, it was the breath of divinity itself. They lived where the fresh rivers mingled with the salt of the Gulf, and this merging of waters became a metaphor for harmony. Sweet and bitter, heaven and earth, divine and human, all met here, in this fragile confluence. Their civilization began not in the conquest of nature, but in cooperation with it. Canals channeled the abundance of the rivers into fertile fields, and with every harvest, the people gave thanks to the deep from which all bounty arose. But Eridu's greatness was not measured in power or population. It was measured in continuity, the unbroken chain of devotion that connected each generation to its past. Even as other cities grew larger and more influential, Eridu retained its identity as the first city, the origin point to which kings and priests traced legitimacy. Ancient Sumerian lists record that kingship descended from heaven first to Eridu, a poetic affirmation that divine authority began here, before it flowed outward to the wider world. In this belief, we see the birth of a profound concept, the sacred foundation of civilization. Governance, ritual, and creation were all threads of the same fabric. To rule well was to uphold cosmic harmony. To neglect justice was to invite disorder. The idea that law derived from divine order, first shaped in Eridu's quiet temples, would one day echo through Hammurabi's code, through Mosaic tradition and beyond. There was serenity in the way life unfolded here. The marshes swayed softly in the wind, their reeds whispering ancient hymns. The scent of baked clay drifted from kilns, mingling with the cool dampness of the water's edge. By night, the sky opened wide and infinite, its stars mirrored in still pools where the first astronomers may have traced the motions of constellations, seeking messages from the gods in the silence of reflection. As centuries passed, the people of Eridu learned to write. From the soft clay of the delta, they formed tablets, pressed with wedge-shaped marks that recorded prayers, offerings, and trade. Writing, like irrigation, was an act of channeling, shaping flow into order. It transformed memory into permanence, turning the fleeting into the eternal. In this way, Eridu's voice began to carry across time, not just through myth but through language itself. Yet the same waters that gave life could also take it away. Floods swept through the delta with unpredictable force, erasing years of labor in a single season. The Sumerians understood these disasters not as wrath, but as reminders of balance, that the order of heaven and earth required humility. In their myths, Enki's waters were both generous and corrective, cleansing the world to begin anew. Through this lens, even destruction became a renewal of harmony. In later ages, when the city's power waned and its temples fell silent, Eridu did not disappear. It transcended. It lived on as a symbol, retold in stories of beginnings. The Sumerians would remember it as the first city, the model of divine architecture. The Babylonians would inherit its myth, tracing their own gods back to its sacred wells. And when archaeologists rediscovered its remains thousands of years later, they found what the ancients had always known, that Eridu was not merely a place, but an idea, the eternal city beneath time's horizon. Today, the mound of Tel Abu Sharain marks the site of ancient Eridu. Beneath its dust lie the foundations of the Iabzu, still layered upon one another like sedimentary echoes of belief. Standing amid the quiet of the desert, one can almost sense the pulse of that first sacred order, the rhythm of water and clay, of human aspiration finding form under the gaze of forgotten gods. The Sumerians taught that Eridu was the home of the Me, the divine decrees that shaped civilization, laws, crafts, music, wisdom, and destiny itself. In their mythology, these principles were gifts bestowed upon humanity by Enki. Through them, mankind learned to build, to govern, to love, and to remember. The city's greatness, then, was not its walls but its ideals, a spiritual architecture that still underlies the story of civilization. Every civilization needs a beginning, not merely of time but of meaning. For the Sumerians, that beginning was Eridu. In its mud-brick sanctuaries, humankind first sought to mirror the heavens. In its waters, they saw the reflection of creation. It was here that the partnership between mortal and divine first took form, a quiet understanding that to build a city was also to build a soul. The wind still moves across the empty site today, whispering over the bones of forgotten walls. And though the marshes have long receded, the silence remains heavy with remembrance. Eridu was the first heartbeat of the world we came to know, the place where faith and form first became one. As Eridu's light began to spread across the southern plains, new settlements awakened to its rhythm, each carrying fragments of the divine pattern. From this first city would rise another, greater, louder, and destined to shape the myths of gods and men alike, the city of Uruk. From the quiet sanctuaries of Eridu, civilization began to stir, expanding northward across the fertile plains. The rivers, like living arteries, carried silt, water, and memory. Along their banks, people gathered once more, drawn by the rhythm of the seasons and the promise of permanence. Out of this gathering would rise Uruk, the city that would transform humanity's relationship with both the gods and itself. Uruk began humbly, as a cluster of reed huts along the Euphrates. Yet by around 4000 BCE, it had become something entirely new, the first true urban center, vast and enduring, a place where architecture became the language of eternity. To the Sumerians, Uruk was not simply a city. It was a cosmic stage, where human endeavor and divine purpose met in visible form. If Eridu had been the world's first whisper, Uruk was its first great declaration. The landscape here was wide and open, bathed in golden light that shimmered over canals and fields. The people of Uruk built with purpose, their hands shaping clay into vision. They raised ziggurats that rose toward the heavens. Mountains made by man, terraced and monumental, their summits gleaming in the sun. These were not fortresses, but symbols of connection, bridges between earth and sky, between humanity and the realm of the gods. At the heart of Uruk stood two sacred precincts. The Eanna district, dedicated to Inanna, goddess of love, fertility, and war, and the Anu district, devoted to the sky god himself. Between them stretched broad avenues lined with temples, workshops, and bustling marketplaces. The sound of commerce mixed with the rhythm of prayer. Artisans shaped vessels of alabaster, priests measured stars, and scribes pressed tablets with wedge-like marks that would become writing, the first written words in human history. Writing began here in the service of order. At first, the marks were lists, tallies of grain, inventories of livestock, accounts of labor. But over time, the symbols grew in meaning. They became cuneiform, the script that would carry poetry, law, and philosophy. In the soft clay of Uruk, the human voice was given permanence. And with this, history itself began, the recording of time, the preservation of thought beyond memory. In the same age, art and myth flourished together. Reliefs carved into stone depicted processions of priests, offerings to the gods, and the sacred marriage between Inanna and Dumuzi, a ritual symbolizing the union of heaven and earth, fertility and order. This was no mere ceremony. It was a reenactment of creation itself, ensuring that the cosmos remained in balance. The priestess, embodying the goddess, and the king, embodying the shepherd god, joined in sacred union to renew the world. Uruk's king was more than a ruler, he was a mediator between realms. His authority was divine by design, granted through lineage that traced back to the Anunnaki themselves. To govern justly was to maintain the link between heaven's decree and earth's life. It was within this framework that the idea of kingship matured, no longer tribal or temporary, but eternal, sanctified through ritual, symbol, and story. Among these early kings, one name would endure through the corridors of time: Gilgamesh. Though his life is half-veiled in legend, his legacy stands at the threshold between myth and history. The tales told of him in later centuries of his strength, his restlessness, and his quest for immortality capture the soul of Uruk itself, a civilization newly aware of its own greatness, yet haunted by the impermanence of life. In Gilgamesh's story, the city becomes a mirror of human ambition, reaching ever upward, yet yearning for something eternal beyond the walls it built. Uruk's architecture reflected this duality. The ziggurat of Anu rose in symmetrical perfection, its baked bricks gleaming white under the Mesopotamian sun. Around it stretched a network of canals, gardens, and courtyards, a deliberate imitation of the cosmic order. The city's planners were not merely builders. They were interpreters of the divine geometry first glimpsed in Eridu. Every wall, every street, was aligned with purpose, as though echoing the structure of the heavens above. The Sumerians believed that civilization itself was a gift of the gods, bestowed through the divine decrees or powers that governed every aspect of existence. According to later myths, these sacred laws were held by Enki in Eridu until Inanna, in her boldness, brought them to Uruk. The story, playful yet profound, symbolized a shift in the world's balance, wisdom moving from the depths of the waters to the brightness of the sky. It was the moment when divine knowledge became the heritage of humankind. In this way, Uruk became not only a physical city but a theological transformation, the embodiment of divine order turned human. Its growth reflected the belief that humanity, by acting in harmony with sacred principles, could participate in creation itself. The temples, workshops, and schools were extensions of this belief, places where learning, craft, and worship were inseparable. By around 3100 BCE, Uruk had become the largest city on Earth, home to tens of thousands of people. Its influence radiated outward across the plains, shaping trade, culture, and governance. The Uruk expansion carried its art and ideas deep into Mesopotamia and beyond, into lands that would one day form the Akkadian and Babylonian worlds. The cylinder seals of Uruk, with their intricate carvings of gods, animals, and scenes of ritual were like signatures of identity, small, beautiful echoes of a vast civilization. In its quiet grandeur, Uruk also introduced the concept of time as sacred rhythm. Festivals marked the cycles of seasons. Calendars traced the movements of celestial bodies. Through careful observation of the skies, priests synchronized earthly life with cosmic order. This early astronomy was not mere curiosity, it was devotion rendered mathematical. To know the heavens was to understand the will of the divine. And yet, amid all its splendor, Uruk remained profoundly human. The same hands that carved temple reliefs also shaped toys for children. The same clay that carried prayers also bore accounts of trade and daily labor. Within its walls, the practical and the sacred coexisted without tension, each sustaining the other. Civilization, in its infancy, was both spiritual and domestic, both cosmic and tender. Over time, Uruk's prominence would wane. Floods, rival cities, and shifting trade routes would erode its central power. But its memory would never fade. The people of later ages would look back on Uruk as the first kingdom of stone and story, the place where humanity stepped into awareness of its own continuity. Its myths would inspire empires long after its walls had turned to dust. The story of Gilgamesh, carved in cuneiform and rediscovered millennia later, remains one of the earliest reflections of human consciousness, the moment when man looked upon his own mortality and sought meaning beyond it. The ruins of Uruk today, known as Warka, still carry that silent gravity. Broken columns lie scattered across the desert, their shadows stretching long beneath the sun. Fragments of carved stone still bear the marks of human hands from 5,000 years ago, marks made in devotion, in duty, and in hope. The air there feels ancient, heavy with the weight of beginnings. Uruk teaches us that civilization is not born in a single moment, but in the slow accumulation of faith, creativity, and memory. Each brick laid upon another, each word impressed upon clay, was an act of belief that human effort could endure. The people of Uruk lived in the presence of their gods, but also within the growing awareness that they, too, could shape the world. In that realization lies the essence of humanity's long journey, the balance between humility and creation. The city's story closes not with conquest, but with continuity. Uruk's ideals of sacred kingship, written memory, and divine order expressed through form would pass into every civilization that followed. From its temples and stories, the rhythm of history began to unfold, echoing through Akkad, Babylon, Assyria, and beyond. Reflective transition. As Uruk's walls gleamed under the southern sun, its influence spread across the plains, inspiring new leaders, new symbols, and new dreams of unity. From this radiant city of myth would arise another vision, the first empire to bind the lands of Mesopotamia under a single rule, the kingdom of Sargon and the rise of Akkad. From the fading brilliance of Uruk rose a new dream, one that reached beyond temples and city walls, beyond the quiet rhythm of the rivers. The age of the Anunnaki had given humanity order. Now humanity sought to mirror that order in power itself. In the dry plains north of Sumer, a child was born who would come to embody this transformation, a man who would turn the unity of belief into the unity of empire. His name was Sargon of Akkad. The stories of Sargon's birth belong half to myth, half to memory. One ancient tablet tells of a woman who set her infant adrift in a basket upon the river, a tale echoed in countless legends after. The child, carried by the waters, was rescued and raised by a gardener. As he grew, his strength and wisdom drew the gaze of the gods. In this quiet parable lies something profound, the belief that destiny, like a river, flows according to the divine current, unseen but inevitable. Historically, Sargon emerged around 2334 BCE, at a time when the city-states of Sumer were at their height, wealthy, independent, and often in rivalry. Each city had its patron god, its own ruler who claimed divine favor. The plains of Mesopotamia were a patchwork of devotion and ambition, bound together by the same rivers yet divided by pride. Into this world stepped Sargon, a man whose vision reached farther than any before him. He began as a servant to Ur, the king of Kish, one of Sumer's great northern cities. Through cunning and charisma, he rose swiftly through the ranks. The legends say that the goddess Ishtar, radiant Inanna of Uruk, granted him her love and protection, a divine sanction that transformed a commoner into a chosen instrument. Whether myth or metaphor, this story reflects a truth. Sargon's rule would blend the mortal and the divine into a single purpose, to bring all lands beneath one authority. From Kish he forged alliances, then armies. His campaigns swept across the plains with methodical precision. City after city fell: Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Nippur, their rulers replaced, their temples preserved but made to serve a new order. Where others conquered for plunder, Sargon conquered for unity. For the first time in human history, the lands of Sumer were drawn together under a single rule: the Akkadian Empire. To the people of the time, this unification was more than political, it was cosmic. The divine order that the Anunnaki had established was now reflected on earth through Sargon's governance. He styled himself not merely as king, but as king of the four quarters of the world. His empire stretched from the mountains of Anatolia to the shores of the Persian Gulf, from the cedar forests of Lebanon to the deserts of Elam. It was a world newly bound by the human hand, an earthly mirror of heaven's unity. The city of Akkad, whose exact site remains lost to time, became the radiant center of this empire. Chroniclers described it as gleaming with wealth and devotion, its temples adorned with bronze, its streets lined with processions of priests and soldiers. The Akkadians spoke a Semitic language, distinct from the Sumerian tongue, yet they absorbed the art, literature, and spirituality of their predecessors. In their hands, Sumer's quiet wisdom became an instrument of empire. Sargon understood that to rule such a vast realm required more than might. It required memory. He established a centralized administration, appointed loyal governors, and maintained a network of scribes who recorded every decree. Clay tablets became instruments of control, inscribed not just with accounts but with commands that flowed outward like the waters of the Euphrates, spreading the rhythm of authority to distant lands. And yet, beneath the structure of empire, Sargon retained a kind of spiritual humility. He claimed that the goddess Ishtar had loved him, walked before him in battle, and granted him victory. This divine favor, as the people saw it, legitimized his rule. It was as though the gods themselves had chosen him to bring unity to the fractured world, a reflection of the Anunnaki's ancient assembly, now embodied in the order of kingship. The empire he built did not erase the Sumerian cities. It connected them. The temples of Enlil in Nippur and Inanna in Uruk continued to flourish. Offerings flowed upward through a new hierarchy, from local priests to imperial priests, from governors to the throne of Akkad. The empire was not an end to the divine order but its earthly expression, a way to maintain balance across lands that had once warred endlessly. In art and inscription, the image of Sargon became archetype. He was depicted wearing a horned crown, a symbol of divinity itself. His gaze was serene, his stance composed, neither boastful nor harsh. The Akkadian sculptors had captured something new in his likeness, the calm assurance of order imposed upon chaos. It was the face of civilization entering maturity. But the dream of empire is a delicate one. Beneath the calm of unity, pressures began to build. The same roads that carried tribute also carried ambition. The same cities that praised Akkad remembered their independence. Yet for more than half a century Sargon held the realm together. His campaigns reached the Mediterranean coast, a feat almost unimaginable for his time. He established garrisons, built canals, and ensured the flow of goods from distant lands. The world, for a brief and shining moment, felt connected. In his later years, rebellion stirred. Droughts and shifting river courses strained the agricultural base upon which the empire depended. City-states that had once bowed began to resist. Still, Sargon endured. The chronicles tell us he had no rival or equal. When he died, his body was returned to Akkad, and his name passed into reverence. His descendants, the Sargonic dynasty, would carry on his legacy, even as the world he created began to tremble. Yet Sargon's true monument was not of stone or bronze. It was the idea he left behind. The concept of empire, of unified civilization guided by a central vision, was his greatest creation. Later rulers, from Babylon to Persia, from Assyria to Rome, would trace their lineage not only through blood, but through the dream first realized on the plains of Mesopotamia. To them, Sargon was more than a man. He was the archetype of kingship itself. When we look back upon this age, we can sense its dual nature, the stillness of order and the restlessness of ambition. The Akkadian Empire stands as both triumph and warning. It revealed the potential of human cooperation, but also the fragility of the systems we build. The rivers that nourished its cities could just as easily drown them. The unity that brought peace could just as swiftly crumble under pride. In this tension lies the quiet poetry of history, that every creation carries within it the seed of its own transformation. Even in ruin, the echo of Akkad endured. Centuries after its fall, scribes wrote hymns to Sargon, praising his conquests and his wisdom. The memory of his empire became part of the mythic landscape, a lesson preserved in clay. Sargon ruled all lands beneath the heavens, and his glory was like the sun. Such words remind us that, to the ancients, greatness was not measured by wealth alone, but by harmony achieved, however briefly, between human will and divine order. Today, the exact site of Akkad remains hidden beneath the Mesopotamian earth, its streets and palaces still sleeping beneath the sand. But its spirit survives in the story of civilization itself, in every empire that sought to unite what was once divided, in every dream that reached beyond its borders. The age of Sargon was not the end of the Sumerian world. It was its transformation. Through his vision, the sacred and the political merged, and humanity's voice grew stronger in the great dialogue of creation. The gods of Eridu and Uruk were still honored, but now they presided over a broader stage, the world as a whole. And in this vastness, the human story began to sound like a mirror to the heavens. Reflective transition. As Sargon's empire flourished beneath the sun, his descendants inherited both his vision and his burden. But the rivers that had once bound the world began to change their course, and with them the destiny of the first empire. In the echoes of Akkad's decline, the ancient gods would whisper once more. In the rise of Naram-Sin, the king who dared to call himself divine, after the long reign of Sargon and the brief rule of his sons, the empire of Akkad entered a new age, luminous, powerful, and perilous. From its heart rose a figure both admired and feared, Naram-Sin, Sargon's grandson. To the people of his time, he was more than a ruler. He was the living bridge between heaven and earth. His name, meaning beloved of sin, the moon god, echoed across the empire like a prayer and a warning. The empire he inherited was vast but restless. The sons of conquered kings still remembered their thrones, and the fields of Mesopotamia demanded constant vigilance against flood and drought. Yet Naram-Sin possessed the same relentless will as his grandfather. Where others saw rebellion, he saw opportunity, to prove that his dynasty's power was not only political but divine. When revolts erupted across the realm, Naram-Sin met them not with fear, but with vision. He gathered his armies and marched through the cities of the south, then east toward the lands of the Zagros Mountains. Ancient inscriptions tell of the great revolt of the Four Quarters, a moment when the world itself seemed to turn against Akkad. Yet Naram-Sin prevailed. The clay tablets that survived speak of his victories as though they were acts of cosmic justice. To his people he had restored order. To himself he had earned a place among the gods. It was in this crucible of triumph that Naram-Sin made a choice that would define his legacy. He declared himself divine. In the inscriptions, he took on the title God of Akkad, the first Mesopotamian ruler to claim such status in life. On his head, he wore the horned crown, a symbol reserved for deities alone. In this act, the sacred hierarchy that had guided Sumer since the dawn of Eridu was quietly rewritten. The king no longer ruled by the gods' favor. He ruled as one of them. His most famous monument, the Victory Stele of Naram-Sin, captures this moment of transformation. Carved in pink limestone, it depicts the king ascending a mountain, leading his soldiers in triumph. His enemies lie beneath him, scattered like leaves in the wind. Above, the symbols of the gods shine, yet they do not overshadow him. He stands taller than all, radiant, calm, eternal. The scene is not of chaos, but of serene domination, a world ordered by divine will made flesh. The artistic language of the stele reveals more than conquest. It shows a civilization evolving in its perception of power. For the Sumerians, kingship was a duty, a covenant with the gods. For Naram-Sin, kingship became embodiment, the belief that through one ruler, divine order could be perfected. This subtle shift marks one of humanity's earliest meditations on absolute power. The idea that the divine and the mortal could merge in purpose or in pride. Under Naram-Sin's rule, the Akkadian Empire reached its zenith. Trade routes stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, carrying copper, cedar, silver, and lapis lazuli. Cities flourished with architecture and art that reflected both reverence and ambition. The temples of Ishtar and Enlil were adorned with new inscriptions celebrating the unity of the realm. Scribes composed hymns that praised Naram-Sin not only as conqueror, but as protector, the divine guardian who held the cosmos in balance. Yet, beneath the order, the seeds of change had begun to stir. As the king elevated himself among the gods, the spiritual harmony of Mesopotamia wavered. The priests who once mediated between heaven and earth found themselves diminished. The people, long accustomed to invoking the names of Enki, Inanna, and Anu, now whispered prayers directly to their king. To some, this was renewal, to others, blasphemy. And in the fragile equilibrium of empire, such shifts carried quiet consequences. Legends tell that Naram-Sin's confidence drew the attention, and perhaps the ire, of the gods themselves. One story, preserved in later Babylonian tablets, describes how he defied the will of Enlil, the lord of wind and destiny. When the oracle refused to sanction his campaign against the city of Ebla, he marched anyway. The gods, angered by his pride, sent the Gutians, a fierce mountain people, to descend upon the empire. Whether myth or metaphor, the tale reflects a truth the ancients understood. That hubris, however divine its cloak, brings imbalance. As droughts deepened and trade faltered, the once glorious cities of Akkad began to fade. Clay records speak of empty granaries and fields left untended. The rivers themselves seemed to change their course, as though nature had turned away. The Gutians' invasions, scattered yet relentless, further weakened the empire's heart. Naram-Sin fought bravely, but even he could not command the sky or the soil. The dream of unity, the harmony of gods and men, began to tremble. Still, his legacy did not vanish into defeat. The artistry, administration, and language of Akkad endured, carried forward by the civilizations that followed. Even in decline, the Akkadian name became a symbol of greatness. Later kings, from Hammurabi of Babylon to Ashurbanipal of Assyria, would look back to Naram-Sin as both a model and a warning, a figure who reached too high, yet illuminated the path for all who sought to govern the world through reason and vision. There is a haunting serenity in the image of Naram-Sin carved upon his stele, the god-king forever ascending, his eyes lifted toward a sun that never sets. To gaze upon it is to feel both awe and unease, to sense the weight of human ambition pressing against the fabric of the divine. For the people of Akkad, he was the culmination of their faith in order. For us, he stands as an early meditation on the limits of power, the moment when humanity first reached for immortality and found that it came with shadow. In the centuries that followed, poets and scribes remembered his name in tones both reverent and mournful. He built temples to the gods, one fragment reads, but his own name he carved upon the stars. Such words speak to the paradox of empire, that even as it fades, it seeks permanence. In the story of Naram-Sin, the listener hears both triumph and loss, the echo of humanity's eternal dialogue with its own creations. When archaeologists uncovered his inscriptions millennia later, they found not arrogance, but artistry, careful lines etched with grace, reflecting a culture that still sought meaning in beauty. The Akkadians, for all their conquests, never abandoned their devotion to the written word, to the quiet act of preserving memory. It is through these tablets, fragile and enduring, that Naram-Sin still speaks, not as a conqueror, but as a reflection of what it means to be human. As his empire waned, so too did the light of Akkad. The Gutians, once dismissed as barbarians from the hills, became the new masters of Mesopotamia for a time. Temples crumbled, canals silted, and the once brilliant city of Akkad vanished into legend. Yet the memory of Sargon's dream and Naram-Sin's divinity remained, whispering through centuries of storytelling, shaping the empires yet to come. Perhaps the ancients understood something we still wrestle with. That power, however radiant, must always yield to the rhythm of the earth, to cycles of creation and return. The rivers that nourished Akkad continued their flow, indifferent to crowns and kingdoms. The same stars that watched over Naram-Sin watched over those who buried him. In that quiet continuity, history finds its peace. Reflective transition. As the light of Akkad dimmed, a new silence spread across Mesopotamia. The great cities lay hushed beneath drifting sand, their stories waiting to be retold. But from their echoes, new voices would rise, of resilience, faith, and rediscovery. The next age would belong not to empire, but to remembrance. The empire that once called itself eternal began to fade, not with a roar of armies, but with the slow unraveling of the earth itself. After the reign of Naram-Sin, the world seemed to lose its rhythm. The rivers that had fed Akkad for centuries began to dry and wander, as if the land itself had grown weary. The great canals silted over. The fertile plains turned brittle and pale beneath an unrelenting sun. Archaeologists would one day uncover layers of wind-blown dust over once bountiful soil, a quiet testament to the great Mesopotamian drought that marked the end of an age. For the people of Akkad, it felt as though the heavens had turned away. Their gods, who had once filled the world with music and meaning, no longer answered the hymns that rose from empty temples. In the tablets that survive, there is no single event of destruction, no cataclysmic invasion that shattered the empire overnight. Instead, there is silence, a long, drawn-out decline that carried both sorrow and resignation. The Gutians, a rugged people from the northern mountains, descended into the lowlands as the empire weakened. To the Akkadians, they were a mystery, wanderers who lived without temples or cities, untouched by the laws of the plains. Some believed they were punishments sent by the gods. Others saw them as the children of a forgotten sky. They swept across the Sumerian heartland, seizing what remained of the faltering cities. To the chroniclers who later recorded these times, the Gutian rule was an age without order, a shadow where language and culture dimmed. Yet even amid this uncertainty, life continued. The people of the south rebuilt in fragments. Small city-states like Ur, Lagash, and Uruk quietly endured. In their temples, priests still tended lamps before the altars, even when no pilgrims came. The Anunnaki, though silent, were not forgotten. Their statues stood watch over empty courtyards, the sacred eyes of stone gazing upon the winds that erased inscriptions from walls. The fall of Akkad became more than a political end. It was a turning inward of the Mesopotamian spirit. The divine kingship of Sargon and Naram-Sin had lifted human ambition toward the heavens, but now, in the aftermath, people looked back to the earth, to the cycles of survival, the small mercies of rain, the continuity of the human heart. In clay texts known as the Curse of Akkad, the story of the empire's fall took on a new shape, a parable rather than a chronicle. The gods, it was said, had grown displeased with Naram-Sin's pride. When he defied Enlil, destroying the god's temple in pursuit of power, the divine council withdrew its favor. The fields turned barren, and enemies rose from the mountains. The storm had left no grain in the fields. One line mourns. The sheepfolds were empty, the fish fled the rivers. In the poetic language of myth, famine and chaos became divine retribution. But within that lament lies something deeper, an early reflection on the fragility of human achievement. The same people who had raised ziggurats to the gods now realized how easily time could reclaim them. The empire's collapse became a meditation on humility, a lesson that no wall, no monument, could stand forever against the patience of the earth. As centuries passed, the Gutian reign waned, and from the southern plains, a new light began to stir, the city of Ur. It was here that Sumerian kingship found rebirth, not in conquest, but in restoration. The rulers of Ur, Ur-Nammu and Shulgi, would rebuild temples, redig canals, and rekindle the language of prayer. The scribes called this era the Sumerian Renaissance, a time when memory itself became sacred. They gathered the remnants of old myths and rewrote them, preserving the stories of the Anunnaki and the first kings before they faded completely into dust. To those who lived through it, the silence that followed Akkad's fall was not mere loss. It was reflection. The people began to see the gods not as voices that commanded empires, but as presences that dwelled within the rhythm of ordinary life, the flow of the river, the birth of a child, the whisper of wind through reeds. The divine counsel that once seemed distant was rediscovered in the patterns of daily endurance. In this way, the Anunnaki survived. Though temples crumbled and names shifted with dialect and dynasty, their essence, the belief that creation was ordered, purposeful and sacred, endured. The myths that had once justified empire now offered solace. The gods withdraw, one hymn says, but their silence teaches. It is perhaps in this quiet phase of history that Mesopotamia reached a deeper wisdom, the understanding that divine favor is not a crown to be worn, but a balance to be tended. Where Naram-Sin sought to become a god, his descendants sought to serve them again. The pendulum of faith had swung back to its still point. Archaeologists studying these centuries find a world marked by both ruin and renewal. In the same layers of soil that contain burned debris from Akkadian cities, they find carefully laid foundations for new ones, signs that humanity did not give up, but patiently began again. Pottery shards reveal that artistry continued even in hardship. Tablets show that the art of writing never vanished. In the midst of silence, the Mesopotamians kept recording, kept remembering. It is difficult to say exactly when the last echoes of Akkad disappeared. No ruins of the capital have yet been found. Its location remains one of archaeology's quiet mysteries. Perhaps it lies buried beneath centuries of silt, or beneath the courses of rivers long shifted. But in another sense, Akkad never vanished. Its language, Akkadian, would become the foundation for Assyrian and Babylonian culture. Its gods would find new names, new temples, new hymns. The dream of unity, born under Sargon, became a current that flowed beneath Mesopotamian history for 1,000 years. The story of Akkad's fall is not a tale of failure. It is a meditation on endurance. It teaches that every civilization, no matter how luminous, must someday yield, not to destruction, but to transformation. The droughts ended, the Gutians faded, and new dynasties rose. The wheel of time continued to turn, each revolution preserving the memory of the one before it. When we read the surviving tablets today, we hear in them not despair, but resilience. The gods have turned their faces. One inscription laments, yet the people still plant. These lines, written by hands that had seen empire collapse, reveal a quiet heroism. The Anunnaki may have withdrawn to the heavens, but humanity continued, guided not by thunder, but by patience. To imagine the plains of Akkad now is to picture emptiness. The faint trace of canals lost beneath dust, the outline of walls blurred by centuries. Yet in that emptiness lies beauty, the serenity of knowing that even silence has meaning. The stars that watched the birth of empire still shine above the same rivers. Time, like the Euphrates itself, has merely changed its course. The fall of Akkad reminds us that history is not a straight road, but a river of return, each bend revealing both loss and renewal. The Anunnaki, once the architects of creation, became in memory the keepers of wisdom. Through their myths, humanity learned to listen to what endures when the world grows quiet. Reflective transition. And so the empire of Akkad passed into the long silence, its temples empty, its songs half-remembered. Yet from that silence, new voices began to rise, carrying with them the memory of what had been. In Ur, in Lagash, in the reborn cities of the south, the people would once again look to the heavens, not to conquer but to understand. As the dust of empire began to settle over the plains of Mesopotamia, something extraordinary took root in the silence. Not the sound of war, but of words. Out of ruin emerged a quiet renaissance of language. The Sumerians, whose voices had long sung through clay and temple stone, met the Akkadians, whose tongue carried the rhythm of conquest and command. Together, their words began to intertwine, shaping a new way for humanity to speak with the divine. Where empires rise and fall, language endures. In the cities that survived Akkad's decline, Ur, Nippur, Lagash, and Uruk, scribes gathered to preserve the sacred texts of Old Sumer. They inscribed hymns, prayers, and creation epics in the intricate wedges of cuneiform, ensuring that no god's name would be forgotten. But as Akkadian influence deepened, a remarkable synthesis began. The Sumerian language, ancient and complex, became the tongue of ritual and temple, the speech of gods. Akkadian, more fluid and adaptable, became the language of daily life, of law, trade, and diplomacy. For the priests of Mesopotamia, this duality held deep meaning. To speak Sumerian was to echo creation itself, to utter the syllables that they believed the gods had once spoken when shaping the world. Akkadian, by contrast, gave those divine ideas motion through human society. It was as though the sacred and the mortal found balance through the blending of their voices. In temple schools, the adubas or houses of tablets, young scribes would rise before dawn. They would sit cross-legged in the cool shadow of ziggurats, their hands dusted with clay. With stylus in hand, they copied the hymns of Inanna, the wisdom of Enki, the decrees of Enlil. Every stroke of the stylus was an act of devotion, every wedge a conversation with eternity. Beside these Sumerian hymns, they would write translations in Akkadian, line by line, bridging two worlds with care and reverence. This work of translation was not mechanical. It was spiritual. Words carried essence, and to change them was to risk changing meaning. Yet through this slow, meticulous process, the Mesopotamians discovered something profound, that language itself was divine, could evolve without losing its soul. When they rendered the name of the goddess Inanna into her Akkadian counterpart, Ishtar, she did not fade. She transformed. Her love, her fury, her radiance remained the same. Only her voice changed. The same was true of Enlil, the stern god of wind and order, whose Akkadian form became Elul. The god Enki, master of water and wisdom, lived on as Ea, his laughter still rippling through the rivers. Even the collective Anunnaki, the divine assembly of heaven and earth, endured, though their stories were told in a new cadence, their myths reframed to suit a people who now spoke in Akkadian. To the ancients, this was not loss but renewal. The gods, they believed, had learned to speak anew. The sacred and the living world had merged in language just as they had once merged in clay. Archaeologists have uncovered tablets from this period that read almost like musical compositions. The same verse rendered twice, first in Sumerian, then in Akkadian, side by side. These bilingual texts were not only linguistic bridges but devotional art. They reveal how deeply the people of Mesopotamia understood the power of continuity. A word written twice was a word made eternal. And through this weaving of tongues, the very identity of the region began to change. Sumerian wisdom found a second life in Akkadian expression. The Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, though born from older Sumerian legends, was preserved and expanded in Akkadian. In its verses, the Anunnaki appear not only as distant judges of fate, but as symbols of cosmic balance, the eternal guardians who watch over life and death, dream and memory. The mythic world of the Sumerians thus found permanence in a language that could travel further. Akkadian spread across empires to Babylon, Assyria, and beyond, carrying the essence of Sumer with it. Each new city that rose along the rivers spoke a slightly different dialect, but the heart of the myth remained unchanged. To whisper Anunnaki was still to invoke the same timeless council of gods, the keepers of destiny who once walked beside humankind. In this harmony of languages lies one of the quiet miracles of human history. Civilizations often vanish when their voices fall silent, yet Mesopotamia survived through translation. The Sumerian tongue, though no longer spoken in marketplaces or courts, lived on in temples for more than 1,000 years after the last Sumerian kings had turned to dust. Priests recited its chants during rituals, believing that the gods heard best in their oldest language. Akkadian scribes, meanwhile, continued to record myths, laws, and prayers in the language of their ancestors, reverently, like caretakers tending a sacred flame. There is a gentle beauty in this coexistence. It reminds us that civilizations do not always die. Sometimes, they whisper into one another, blending until their boundaries blur. The fall of Akkad did not silence the Anunnaki. It merely gave them a new voice. Through the merging of tongues, their presence deepened. Their myths spread farther than the reach of any empire. In one hymn recovered from Nippur, a priest writes in both languages, "O Enlil, who decrees the fates of heaven and earth, your word is the light that guides kings." Whether spoken in Sumerian or in Akkadian, your truth remains one. These lines, written over 4,000 years ago, carry a simplicity that transcends their time. They reveal an early understanding that meaning can survive transformation, that the divine resides not in the sound of words, but in the intention behind them. In the calm light of history, the fusion of Sumerian and Akkadian stands as a quiet triumph. It shows how memory can adapt, how reverence can evolve without breaking. Through translation, the Mesopotamians built something stronger than empire, a continuity of thought. Their languages became vessels of resilience, carrying the wisdom of gods through the fragility of human generations. When scholars millennia later deciphered the cuneiform tablets, it was as if these ancient voices had been waiting patiently beneath the soil, their messages intact. The words, once whispered to statues in flickering torchlight, spoke again, across time, across silence. Through them, the Anunnaki lived once more, their council reconvened in the minds of those who sought to understand. To listen to these rediscovered texts today is to feel that same stillness that once filled the temples. The awareness that language connects all who dream, remember, and seek meaning. The clay may crumble, but the words remain, bearing the memory of rivers and stars. The fusion of Akkadian and Sumerian reminds us that culture is not merely preserved by monuments or walls, but by the stories we teach forward. The Mesopotamians, in blending their tongues, taught the future how to remember, how to keep the sacred alive not through dominance, but through understanding. And so, the gods of Sumer did not vanish into myth. They were reborn in the flowing language of Akkad, their voices softened by time, yet undiminished. Through every retelling, every translation, they remained constant companions of the human imagination, evolving as we evolved, listening as we learned to speak anew. Reflective transition. As the two tongues became one chorus, the old and the new world sang together. Through language, faith found endurance, and the Anunnaki, reborn in every word, continued their watch. But even as words united heaven and earth, kings and cities began to dream once more of power, and the world prepared for another turning of its great wheel. When the dust of Akkad finally settled, and the winds of time carried away the echoes of empire, the land between the rivers entered a season of quiet rebuilding. The cities that had once trembled beneath Sargon's banners now lay fractured, their canals silted, their temples eroded by neglect and drought. Yet beneath the weary soil of Mesopotamia, something stirred once more, a yearning to reassemble the scattered pieces of order. Out of this longing rose a city that had never fully vanished, a name whispered since the dawn of civilization. Ur. Ur, standing proudly on the edge of the southern marshlands, had long been a city of devotion. Its people, accustomed to both the gifts and cruelties of the rivers, believed that prosperity was not merely the result of labor, but of harmony between heaven and earth. And so, when the chaos that followed Akkad's fall began to subside, it was Ur that reached toward the divine again, seeking not conquest but renewal. From its walls, a new dynasty emerged, one that would restore the rhythm of gods and men, measured not by empire, but by reverence. At the heart of this restoration stood Ur and Nippur, a name that became synonymous with wisdom and restraint. Where the conquerors of old had sought dominion through the sword, Ur and Nippur sought it through structure, laws, temples, and irrigation that bound his people together. His rise marked not a return to the ambitions of Akkad, but the mending of its fractures. For in his reign, Mesopotamia found something it had nearly forgotten: stability born of cooperation, not fear. Under the watchful gaze of Nana, the moon god to whom Ur was dedicated, the city transformed. The great ziggurat of Ur began to rise, tier upon tier of sun-baked brick, glowing under the pale light of its divine patron. To walk near it was to feel the presence of something both earthly and eternal. Priests tended to its terraces as though tending to the very order of the cosmos. Every stone laid was an offering, every ritual a renewal of balance between humankind and the unseen. Through architecture, faith once again found a shape. Ur's revival was not isolated. Across Sumer, cities that had lain dormant stirred to life, their canals dredged, their granaries filled. The floodplains began to hum with cultivation, and trade routes once again threaded through the plains, carrying goods and ideas to distant lands. Merchants from Elam, traders from Dilmun, and envoys from the Zagros foothills came to Ur's gates. In their exchanges, a fragile peace blossomed, not born of empire, but of shared necessity. For after centuries of upheaval, the people of Mesopotamia seemed to understand that endurance was not found in conquest, but in continuity. The most enduring legacy of Ur and Nippur's reign, however, was not its architecture nor its trade, but its law. Carved upon tablets and preserved across the centuries, the Code of Ur and Nippur stands as one of humanity's earliest written legal systems. It revealed a civilization striving to temper justice with compassion. The laws spoke of fairness, of restitution, of the need to replace vengeance with order. They were gentle compared to later codes, their tone not cruel but corrective. In them, we glimpse a society beginning to value the dignity of life and the stability of community. Such efforts reflected a deeper belief that society itself was sacred. To govern was to maintain cosmic harmony, just as the priests maintained the rituals of the gods. The ruler was not merely a king. He was the keeper of balance, the axis between divine and mortal. Ur and Nippur's successors would inherit this vision, and in doing so, the dynasty of Ur would weave faith and governance into a single enduring pattern. His son, Shulgi, carried this inheritance to even greater heights. A scholar, poet, and administrator, Shulgi sought to perfect the divine order his father had begun. He reorganized temples, improved infrastructure, and established systems of record-keeping that reflected an almost modern sense of efficiency. Under his rule, the scribes of Ur reached new mastery in the cuneiform script, the written voice of civilization itself. Tablets from his era sing with precision. Lists of offerings, hymns, and decrees, all etched with the quiet pride of a people who had relearned how to build, not destroy. Yet beneath the order, there lingered a fragile tension, the kind that always haunts golden ages. The peace of Ur was delicate, dependent on cooperation among cities and the goodwill of the gods. As the rivers shifted and harvests grew uncertain, omens began to trouble the priests. The same moon that once guided their rituals now seemed to watch with distant eyes. And though Shulgi's reign endured for nearly half a century, the dynasty that followed him could not maintain the balance he had so carefully nurtured. Still, the age of Ur remains a beacon in Mesopotamian memory, a reminder that after every collapse, humanity finds ways to rebuild not only its walls but its sense of purpose. Archaeologists uncovering its ruins have found layers of quiet devotion. Temple offerings, fragments of hymns, impressions of tiny seal cylinders used by officials to mark trade goods. These small artifacts tell of lives lived in steady rhythm. Farmers, priests, scribes, all united by the belief that order, once broken, could be restored through care and continuity. In this sense, the third dynasty of Ur was more than a political restoration. It was a moral one. It sought to reassert meaning in a world scarred by chaos, to remind humanity that civilization, at its core, is an act of faith. The ziggurat that rose from the plain of Ur was not only an offering to Nana, but a declaration that even after empire and ruin, the human spirit remains capable of rebuilding the link between heaven and earth. As centuries passed, the great ziggurat would weather the sun and sand, its form softened but never erased. Pilgrims and kings from later ages would gaze upon its tiers and recall the time when Ur was the heart of a renewed order. Even today, under the same moon that shone upon its builders, its silhouette speaks quietly of endurance, of a civilization that rediscovered balance in the silence that followed the fall. And as the night deepens over the ancient plains, we might imagine the priests of Ur standing upon the ziggurat's summit, their chants rising toward the stars. The wind carries their voices across the centuries, whispering of law, of faith, of the endless dance between chaos and creation. As the moon drifts westward and its light fades upon the riverbanks, the story of Ur gently yields to the next turning of the wheel, the coming of new rulers, new storms, and the eternal search for harmony beneath the changing skies. When the name of Ur-Nammu faded into legend, it was his son Shulgi who carried the torch of renewal into the heart of Mesopotamia's long night. His reign, stretching nearly half a century, became one of the most remarkable in ancient history, an age when the balance between heaven and earth seemed once again attainable. Where his father had rebuilt the foundations, Shulgi sought to refine them, shaping the realm not only through governance and faith, but through a deep and deliberate artistry. In his time, the city of Ur shone under the silver gaze of the moon, and the kingdom's light reached farther than any since the empire of Akkad. To live in Shulgi's Mesopotamia was to dwell in a world of rhythm and ritual. From sunrise to moonrise, life moved according to the calendar of the gods, a precise harmony of offerings, festivals, and daily labor. The fields along the Euphrates gleamed with barley and dates. Herds grazed in the pastures once made barren by conflict. Trade caravans crossed the plains again, bearing copper from Magan, timber from Lebanon, and lapis lazuli from distant lands beyond the mountains. Every road, every channel bore the touch of organization. Shulgi's rule, at its heart, was an exercise in order, the refinement of what his father had restored. Yet this order was not merely administrative. It was philosophical. Shulgi believed that a ruler's first duty was not conquest but harmony, between the divine, the human, and the natural. In his inscriptions, written in the stately wedge of cuneiform, he describes himself as the shepherd who brings abundance, and the singer of hymns to the gods. He saw kingship as both burden and devotion. His reign embodied the belief that civilization itself was a sacred act, one that demanded wisdom as much as power. Under his guidance, Ur became a beacon of scholarship and devotion. The scribal schools of the city flourished, teaching the art of writing, mathematics, and administration. Clay tablets from this era reveal a society of astonishing literacy and precision. Contracts, inventories, hymns, and letters all written with an elegance that spoke of stability. In temple archives, clerks catalogued offerings to the gods. In royal libraries, poets composed hymns in Shulgi's honor, portraying him as both ruler and sage. Through these records, we glimpse a civilization whose daily life was interwoven with ritual, memory, and reverence. Among Shulgi's greatest achievements was his reorganization of the temple system, the spiritual heart of Mesopotamian life. He standardized offerings, ensured fair distribution of temple wealth, and appointed high priests loyal not to themselves, but to the vision of divine order. The temples were not merely houses of worship. They were centers of welfare, education, and economic life. Grain was stored in their courtyards. Artisans worked in their courtyards. Scribes kept their records within clay-walled chambers fragrant with incense. Through the temples, Shulgi maintained both spiritual and social stability, ensuring that faith and prosperity remained intertwined. But Shulgi was not content to be remembered as a mere administrator. He was, by every surviving account, a man of intellect and art. He claimed to be a skilled runner, musician, and poet, accomplishments that symbolized his ideal of balance between body, spirit, and mind. In one famous inscription, he boasts of running from Nippur to Ur and back in a single day, a symbolic act demonstrating his divine endurance, his closeness to the gods. Though such feats likely carried ritual meaning more than literal truth, they reveal how deeply he conceived of his kingship as performance, a living embodiment of strength, grace, and devotion. Shulgi's hymns, some of which survive on broken tablets, reveal a deeply introspective ruler. They are written in language that feels both grand and tender, verses praising the gods, celebrating his achievements, and meditating on the fragility of life. "I am the king of wisdom," he writes. "My heart is filled with songs of praise." In these words, we sense the calm assurance of a monarch who ruled not by the sword alone, but by the conviction that knowledge was sacred. Through him, the ruler's voice became the voice of the city itself, proud yet humble before the cosmos. This devotion to order and learning extended into the practical world as well. Shulgi established a network of state granaries and road stations, linking the major cities of his realm. These way stations offered food and shelter to travelers, traders, and messengers, a precursor to the organized infrastructure that future empires would emulate. Such efficiency allowed communication to flow smoothly across the land, knitting distant communities into a shared identity. Through Shulgi's governance, Mesopotamia briefly became a land not of isolated city-states, but of coordinated unity. And yet, even in this golden light, shadows gathered at the horizon. The very strength of Ur's system, its dependence on centralized control, its meticulous order, made it vulnerable to the subtle shifts of time. As the decades passed, pressures from nomadic tribes at the fringes of the realm began to grow. Climate patterns shifted. Harvests became less predictable. The river that had given life could also withdraw it. In the north, the Amorites began to move, pressing closer to the settled lands. The gods, once thought pacified, began to speak again through omens of unrest. But Shulgi, in his wisdom, seemed to understand the impermanence of all human order. His inscriptions often end not in pride, but in reflection, reminders that the favor of the gods is fleeting, that kings must act as stewards, not masters. This humility, rare among ancient rulers, gave his reign an enduring grace. Even as the signs of instability grew, he continued to build, to write, to teach, as if to leave behind a blueprint for balance that could outlast him. Archaeological evidence from Ur and its neighboring cities suggests that Shulgi's administration maintained remarkable prosperity late into his rule. Temples were expanded, workshops thrived, and art reached a level of subtlety unmatched for centuries. Jewelry from his period gleams with delicate craftsmanship. Seals depict scenes of harmony between gods and humans, rather than conquest or destruction. The tone of the age was one of equilibrium, a civilization consciously preserving serenity against the turbulence of time. The later kings of Ur would inherit his legacy, though not always his wisdom. After Shulgi's death, the structure he had built began slowly to strain under its own weight. His successors struggled to maintain the intricate system he had perfected. Natural disasters, invasions, and economic fatigue would, in time, erode the order he had so carefully tended. Yet the memory of his reign endured, preserved in the tablets of scribes and the quiet resilience of the people who once walked beneath the moonlit ziggurat. To the ancients, Shulgi became more than a king. He became a symbol of divine alignment. His name was invoked in prayers long after his dynasty fell, as a ruler who embodied the ideal of justice, devotion, and intellectual grace. Even in decline, his image remained that of the shepherd of nations, whose light guided his people through uncertainty. In the broader current of human history, Shulgi's legacy represents a truth both humbling and inspiring. That civilizations thrive not only on conquest, but on care, on the deliberate pursuit of harmony between people, land, and faith. His age was not loud with war, but steady with purpose. It was a civilization at peace with its gods, seeking perfection not through expansion, but through refinement. And so, when the moon rose above Ur's towering ziggurat, its pale light washing over terraces and shrines, it was said that Shulgi himself walked among his people in spirit, a silent guardian of the order he had restored. The wind that moved through the reeds along the Euphrates carried his memory, whispering of measured wisdom and the serenity of well-kept balance. As the dynasty of Ur continued, the silver glow of its kings would begin to wane, their harmony tested by hunger, invasion, and time. Yet for a moment in the long night of history, under the watchful eye of the moon, humanity glimpsed what true order might look like, and how easily it could fade when the light begins to dim. When the quiet strength of Ur began to fade, and the cities of Mesopotamia stirred once more with ambition, a new idea began to shape the destiny of kings. The gods, once distant powers ruling from the unseen heavens, were now drawn closer. They were claimed by men who sought to govern in their name. The fall of great empires had shown how fragile mortal rule could be. Yet if a king could speak as the voice of the divine, then his authority might transcend the limits of flesh and time. Thus dawned the age of divine right, when rulers no longer reigned as mere administrators, but as chosen vessels of the gods themselves. The temples, once the heart of faith, became the sanctuaries of kingship. Coronations were no longer simple declarations of power. They were sacred rituals, reenactments of the world's first creation, binding heaven and earth anew. Within the ziggurats and courtyards, priests recited hymns invoking the Anunnaki, those primordial gods who had first shaped humankind. To be king was to inherit their blessing, to sit, if only symbolically, at the threshold of eternity. The ruler's every act became a gesture within a divine drama, his decrees extensions of the gods' law, his victories reflections of their will. In this merging of faith and rule, the Mesopotamian world found both unity and tension. On one hand, the divine mandate brought comfort to a people weary of instability. The ruler was no longer merely a man. He was the guardian of cosmic balance, tasked with keeping chaos at bay. But within this same belief lay the seed of control, for to question the king was to question the gods themselves. The line between devotion and obedience blurred, and faith became as much a tool of governance as it was a path to transcendence. The Anunnaki, once distant figures of creation, now became patrons of royal identity. Kings traced their ancestry to them, carved their names beside divine symbols, and inscribed prayers upon clay tablets to proclaim their eternal favor. In temple hymns, rulers were described as shepherds chosen by Enlil, or warriors guided by Inanna's hand. Even the architecture of the cities reflected this belief. Palaces and temples began to mirror each other, twin symbols of divine human partnership. A king's throne was no longer simply a seat of rule. It was a reflection of the heavens, a stage upon which the gods themselves seemed to move. Archaeological discoveries from this period reveal the careful choreography of divine kingship. Inscriptions from Ur, Nippur, and Isen record elaborate ceremonies of coronation. The anointing of the king with sacred oil, the recitation of genealogies linking him to ancient deities, the procession through temple gates beneath banners bearing celestial emblems. Each gesture was symbolic, echoing the first act of creation, the gods choosing order over chaos. Through ritual, the king was reborn not as a man, but as a cosmic intermediary. This union of religion and power transformed law itself. The codes that had once governed trade and conduct now took on sacred weight. To disobey a decree was to defy divine will. Justice became a mirror of the heavens. Yet within these same tablets we find the first hints of moral reasoning, laws that appealed not only to divine authority, but to human conscience. In their quiet way, these early scribes were redefining justice as a dialogue between heaven and earth, faith and compassion. Behind every ruler stood the priesthood, guardians of both ritual and record. They were the interpreters of omens, the keepers of calendars, and the voices that bridged kings with gods. Their power was subtle but immense. It was they who declared divine favor, they who discerned whether the gods smiled upon a reign or turned away in silence. The cooperation between temple and palace became the foundation of Mesopotamian governance. To rule well, a king had to maintain harmony not only among his subjects, but among the unseen forces that shaped their fate. And yet, even in this harmony, unease lingered. For what happens when divine will and human ambition diverge? The chronicles whisper of rulers who claimed too much, who declared themselves gods incarnate rather than chosen servants. In these moments, faith trembled on the edge of hubris. The temples, once homes of humble devotion, could become instruments of self-deification. Statues of kings began to stand beside those of deities. Hymns once sung to Enlil or Inanna were rewritten in honor of living men. The line between reverence and pride grew thin, shimmering like heat upon the plains. The people, too, felt this transformation. Their prayers became increasingly intertwined with politics. To petition the gods was, in a sense, to appeal to the throne. When floods came or droughts persisted, blame and faith moved hand in hand. The king was praised for prosperity and held accountable for disaster. The relationship between ruler and subject was no longer defined only by law or tribute, but by shared spiritual destiny. Every offering, every festival, reaffirmed the bond between heaven, earth, and crown. Still, within the solemn cadence of ritual, there remained moments of quiet grace. In hymns recovered from this era, one hears not propaganda, but genuine reverence. Poets describe kings walking through temple courtyards at dawn, placing offerings before the statues of their gods, whispering prayers for wisdom rather than conquest. Theirs was a world in which power was inseparable from piety, where even the mightiest bowed before mysteries older than time. But this sacred union carried a paradox. When faith serves authority, it also risks becoming fragile. A single failed omen, a broken statue, a misinterpreted eclipse could unravel the illusion of divine favor. The people who once believed their king chosen by the gods could, just as swiftly, believe him abandoned. History would prove that no ruler, however favored, could hold eternity in his grasp. The divine right that legitimized rule could, in a moment, condemn it. Still, the idea endured not as tyranny, but as a framework for meaning. To the Mesopotamians, every act of governance reflected the cosmic dance of creation and destruction. A decree was not merely a command, it was a ritual of order. The harvest, the building of walls, the judging of disputes, all were echoes of the gods' eternal labor to shape the world from chaos. In this sense, kingship became an act of faith performed daily before both mortal and divine witnesses. Today, when we look upon the ruins of Ur and Nippur, we can still sense the faint geometry of that belief. The ziggurats rise not only as temples, but as monuments to the idea that the divine once walked among men. Their stairways seem to invite ascent, a bridge between clay and sky, between the aspirations of humankind and the unreachable realm of the gods. Though the kings who claimed divine favor are long dust, the architecture of their faith remains, whispering of a time when heaven and earth shared a common horizon. As night deepens over those ancient stones, the wind carries echoes of the old coronation hymns, voices rising softly beneath the stars, affirming that even in the shifting sands of time, humanity will always seek to mirror the heavens in its laws, its art, and its dreams. And yet, as every ancient priest knew, the hearts of gods are unpredictable, and faith, like empire, is fragile. From devotion would come dissent, and from harmony, the first trembling notes of division. To descend into darkness is to seek the light anew. So begins the oldest of all journeys, the descent of Inanna, queen of heaven and earth. Hers is a story carved not in conquest, but in surrender. Not in power, but in the fragile beauty of understanding. It is a tale whispered in the hush before dawn, when shadow and light are equal for a breath of time. Inanna was the radiant one, goddess of love and war, of passion and harvest, of all that blooms and all that burns. Yet even she, the morning star, grew restless beneath the endless brilliance of the heavens. Her gaze turned downward, toward the realm of her sister Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld. There, in the silence beneath all creation, lay the mystery of endings, the secret of death itself. Why did she go? The tablets tell us many reasons. Some say pride, that Inanna sought to extend her dominion even into death. Others say compassion, that she wished to comfort her grieving sister, who mourned the loss of her husband. But perhaps the truest reason lies between them: curiosity. For even the gods are not free from the yearning to know what lies beyond. Inanna prepared herself for the descent as one might for a sacred rite. She adorned her body with the 7 symbols of her power: the crown of the heavens, the rod and ring of justice, the lapis beads of beauty, the breastplate of courage, the golden ring of command, the measuring rod of wisdom, and the royal garment woven with starlight. Each piece shimmered as she stood before the first gate of the underworld, a fortress guarded by Neti, the warden who speaks for the dead. "Who comes to the house from which none return?" he asked. "Inanna, Queen of Heaven," she replied. "I come in peace." The words echoed like wind through stone. At each gate, she was asked to surrender one symbol of her power: her crown at the first, her beads at the next, her scepter, her robe, her jewels. One by one they fell away, until the Queen of Heaven stood naked before the Queen of Shadows. In this descent, from light into stillness, from glory into humility, the myth reveals its truth. No one, not even a goddess, enters death clothed in pride. To pass beyond the living world is to be stripped of all identity, until only essence remains. Ereshkigal sat upon her throne of obsidian, eyes heavy with the grief of eternity. Around her stood the Anunnaki, the 7 judges of the underworld. They did not speak. They did not move. Their gaze was the weight of judgment itself, eternal, unblinking, without malice and without mercy. When Inanna bowed before them, the silence deepened. For a moment the cosmos itself seemed to pause. Then Ereshkigal raised her hand, and the Queen of Heaven fell. Inanna, radiant Inanna, was turned to lifeless clay and hung upon a hook upon the wall. In that moment life itself faltered. Rivers slowed, seeds refused to sprout, and love lost its warmth. The world above mourned without knowing why. But death, as the ancients knew, is never the end. It is the pause before renewal. 3 days and 3 nights passed. The gods grew uneasy. Enki, the god of wisdom and deep waters, heard the cries of the earth and fashioned 2 small beings from the dust beneath his fingernails. Silent, humble, without gender or desire. Into their tiny hands he placed the food and water of life. "Go," he whispered. "Descend the 7 gates. Do not demand, do not weep. Listen." And so they did. They found Ereshkigal writhing in the agony of birth, the pain of creation mirrored in the sorrow of loss. The small beings did not try to comfort her. They only listened. When she moaned, they moaned. When she sighed, they sighed. And in that mirroring, something shifted. Ereshkigal looked upon them with weary gratitude and asked what they desired. They spoke softly, "Give us the body that hangs upon your wall." And so Inanna was given back. Her clay restored, her breath rekindled by the waters of life. She rose, trembling, neither goddess nor mortal, but something between. Yet the laws of the underworld are absolute. No one may ascend without sending another in her place. The Anunnaki spoke as one, their voices like the movement of stone. If Inanna rises, another must remain. Thus began her ascent, not triumphant, but heavy with knowledge. As she climbed the 7 gates, her ornaments were returned one by one, but now they shone with new meaning. Her crown no longer marked dominion but understanding. Her robe no longer symbolized pride, but the vulnerability she had faced. When she emerged into the light, the world stirred again. Rivers flowed. Crops awakened. The songs of birds returned to the air. Yet the story does not end there, for balance must be kept. At the gates of her city, Inanna found her husband Dumuzi, seated upon her throne, dressed in royal splendor. He did not mourn her absence, he celebrated it. The sight struck Inanna like cold iron. She looked upon him and saw in his calm face the arrogance she had shed. And so she pointed to him and spoke, Let him descend in my place. The Anunnaki took him. And for half the year Dumuzi remained below, a symbol of the dying harvest, of the stillness of winter. But when his sister took his place, he returned, and life began again. Thus, through loss and return, the world found rhythm. The descent of Inanna became the mythic pulse of the seasons, of death and rebirth, of despair and renewal. To the people of Mesopotamia, this was not merely a story of gods, but of the soul itself. Every life, they believed, mirrors this descent. The surrender of ego, the confrontation with darkness, the rebirth that follows understanding. Even the kings who claimed divine favor were, in the end, bound by this truth, that power must fall before it can rise again. The Anunnaki, who judged Inanna in silence, remained the keepers of that law. They were not cruel, only constant guardians of balance, reminding gods and mortals alike that creation and destruction are but two faces of the same eternal act. In every generation, the story was retold around hearths, in temple hymns, upon tablets pressed with careful hands. It was sung not as tragedy, but as promise. For in Inanna's descent lay the assurance that even in death, there is motion. Even in silence, renewal stirs. As the last lines of the hymn fade, we are left with her image. The morning star rising once more above the horizon, radiant with the memory of shadow. She has seen the depths and returned, her light no longer perfect, but wiser, softer, eternal. And from the underworld's stillness, life would rise again, in gardens, in song, in empire. The rivers never forget. Even when cities crumble, their waters remember the hands that once shaped their course. And so it was with Babylon, the city that rose where older empires had fallen, where myth and power intertwined like reeds along the Euphrates. In the centuries after the fall of Ur, the Sumerian world had scattered. Kingdoms rose and vanished in the long shadow of memory. Yet amid this shifting landscape, a new center began to form, a city whose name would one day echo as a symbol of both grandeur and human longing. Babylon. At first, it was only a settlement among many. Its early kings were modest, its temples humble compared to those of Ur or Uruk. But from the clay of this small city, a new vision began to emerge, one that sought not only to rebuild, but to reorder creation itself, to give the divine hierarchy a single heart. The Sumerians had known many gods: Enlil, lord of the air; Enki, keeper of wisdom; Inanna, radiant in both war and love. But Babylon, in its rise, crowned another Marduk. Marduk was not born among the earliest gods. In the old myths, he was the son of Enki, a youthful deity associated with storms and fertility. Yet as Babylon's influence grew, so too did his stature. The city's priests, the keepers of its sacred narrative, began to weave a tale that placed Marduk not as a minor divine son, but as the very orchestrator of order. In the Enuma Elish, the great Babylonian creation epic, this transformation found its form. The story begins in chaos, a cosmic ocean of mingled waters, Apsu and Tiamat, the primordial forces of fresh and salt. From their union came the first gods, restless and loud, whose clamor disturbed the silence of eternity. Apsu sought to destroy them, but was slain by Enki. Then Tiamat, the mother of monsters, rose in fury, her body birthing serpents, dragons, and storms. Against her, none of the older gods dared to stand, until Marduk stepped forward. The myth tells of his calm courage. He did not shout or boast. He offered to face the chaos only if, when he triumphed, he would be granted supreme authority, the right to establish order among gods and men alike. The others agreed, and so Marduk prepared his weapons: the net of the winds, the bow of the four directions, and words of command. When the battle began, the heavens trembled. Tiamat roared, her breath a tempest, but Marduk released his storm winds into her mouth, piercing her heart with an arrow of light. Then, in an act both terrible and beautiful, he divided her body. Half became the heavens, half the earth. From chaos, form was born. From destruction, the ordered world. When the priests of Babylon recited this myth at the New Year festival, They did so not as an act of violence, but of renewal. For them, Marduk's victory was the daily miracle of existence, the rising sun, the steady rhythm of the seasons, the endurance of law and language. In this story, the people of Babylon found comfort, that the world was not a fragile accident, but the deliberate creation of a just and watchful God. The older deities, the Anunnaki, were not forgotten. They were folded into Marduk's court, wise counselors, divine scribes, judges of destiny. Yet their power was now subordinate, part of the great cosmic order that Babylon claimed to uphold. It was not a rejection of the past, but a reorganization of it, a transformation from many voices into one grand harmony. To walk through Babylon in those early centuries was to feel that order made stone. The streets were drawn like lines of scripture, straight and purposeful. The temples rose tier by tier, crowned by the great ziggurat, the Anunnaki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. The summit was said to touch the sky, a bridge between the human and the divine. Within its shadow, priests watched the heavens, tracing the courses of planets and stars. They believed these lights to be the writing of the gods, the language of Marduk himself, inscribed upon the night. The science they practiced, astronomy and mathematics, was never divorced from reverence. Knowledge was devotion, order was worship. Yet even in their certainty, the people knew that balance must be kept. The world was stable only so long as the king honored Marduk's covenant, ruling not through pride, but through justice. At Ichikitu, the New Year's festival, the king was stripped of his royal insignia before Marduk's statue. The high priest struck his face and demanded that he confess any failings. Only if the god's statue shed tears of pity was his rule reaffirmed. Through ritual humility, Babylon reaffirmed the principle at the heart of its faith, that order cannot exist without remembrance of chaos. Marduk's triumph over Tiamat was not a conquest to be celebrated in arrogance, but a balance to be renewed through humility. As centuries passed, Babylon became the voice of this new divine order. Its scribes copied the old Sumerian hymns, its scholars translated the wisdom of Akkad, and its storytellers gave shape to a theology that united heaven, earth, and underworld. Through Marduk, the gods of Mesopotamia found coherence. Through Babylon, the echoes of the Anunnaki endured. The Anunnaki, though silent, still presided over judgment in the underworld. Their role was now distant, eternal custodians rather than rulers. But every priest knew that their law remained the foundation of Marduk's authority. For order could not exist without the memory of those who first measured it. The people of Babylon saw themselves as living within a sacred architecture. Every canal, every gate, every brick a reflection of divine pattern. When they spoke of justice, they spoke of Marduk. When they measured the stars, they read his wisdom. When they sowed and harvested, they reenacted the cosmic cycle of death and rebirth first sung in the hymns of Inanna and Dumuzi. In the stillness of the night, when the ziggurat cast its long shadow across the sleeping city, one could almost imagine the ancient gods watching, not with jealousy, but with a kind of resigned serenity. Their age had passed into myth, yet through Babylon, their essence remained alive. Thus, the Anunnaki became the roots beneath Marduk's towering order, unseen, but enduring. In every recited tablet, in every carved relief of the lion and the dragon, their ancient breath lingered. The new god had risen, but his foundation was the same river clay that had cradled the first dreams of Sumer. And as Babylon reached upward, it carried with it the weight of every civilization that had come before. Akkad's ambition, Ur's devotion, Eridu's mystery. Each layer a remembrance, each stone a prayer that order might hold a little longer against the returning tide of chaos. For the Mesopotamians understood what few civilizations dared to speak aloud, that even divine order is fragile. The gods may rise, but the rivers shift. The cities may gleam, but the dust remembers. In that tension between permanence and impermanence, Babylon found its greatness. And in Marduk's steady gaze, the people found the comfort of knowing that, for now the heavens were aligned, the floods were tamed, and the world still turned under divine decree. But order, however perfect, invites its own undoing. For every city that reaches the sky, the earth waits patiently below. As the lamps of the temples burned into the deep hours of the night, the winds from the western deserts began once more to stir, carrying with them the faint scent of change. What does it mean for law to be written not merely in stone, but in the stars? To the Babylonians, justice was not a human invention. It was the reflection of a higher pattern, the rhythm that governed both the flood of rivers and the movement of the heavens. In their understanding, order was divine geometry, and law was its earthly echo. The city of Babylon, radiant under the gaze of Marduk, became the living heart of that harmony. Among its kings, none embodied this ideal more profoundly than Hammurabi. His name would endure for thousands of years, carved in basalt, whispered through empires, studied by scholars who would never see the Euphrates. Yet in his own time he was not merely a ruler. He was a custodian of balance, a servant of the sacred order. Hammurabi ascended to the throne around 1792 BCE, inheriting a kingdom already shaped by the legacy of Marduk's theology. The gods, it was said, had arranged the world in layers, heaven, earth, and the deep, and the king's task was to preserve the delicate correspondence between them. To govern was not simply to command. It was to maintain the resonance between cosmic and human law. The Code of Hammurabi, that great basalt stele rising like a dark flame toward the sky, is more than a list of rules. It is an act of worship. Its surface is covered in cuneiform script, more than 300 provisions ranging from commerce to crime, irrigation to inheritance. But before the laws themselves, before any mention of punishment or restitution, stands a scene of revelation. Hammurabi receiving the rod and ring, symbols of authority and measurement, from Shamash, the god of justice and light. It is a moment of profound symbolism. The king is not creating law, he is receiving it. He becomes the intermediary between divine wisdom and human need. Every decision he makes, every judgment he renders, is an attempt to align mortal life with celestial order. For the Babylonians, the concept of justice, kidam, was inseparable from truth, from the very structure of the cosmos. A fair measure, a balanced scale, an honest word, these were reflections of the world's divine architecture. When a man cheated in trade, he was not simply deceiving his neighbor. He was disturbing the balance of creation. In the soft light of the temples, scribes pressed the laws into wet clay, ensuring that the same order which guided the stars would also guide the city's markets, marriages, and disputes. To them, the written word was sacred, a living thread binding heaven to earth. And yet, Hammurabi's code was not born in stillness. His reign was an era of consolidation, of war and diplomacy woven together with careful strategy. From his capital, he united the city-states of Mesopotamia, Larsa, Mari, Eshnunna, not through conquest alone, but through administration and reform. The laws were his monument, but his true legacy lay in the unity they brought. The preamble to the code, often overlooked by those who study it for its punishments, reads like a hymn. Hammurabi declares that he was chosen to make justice visible in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evil, that the strong may not oppress the weak. This was no abstract philosophy, it was the moral breath of empire. And yet, the laws were firm. The principle of reciprocity, an eye for an eye, reflected a society deeply attuned to balance. For modern ears, such measures may seem harsh, but in their time they were a safeguard against chaos. Justice was not vengeance. It was equilibrium restored. When a builder's negligence caused a death, he paid with his life, not for cruelty's sake, but to preserve the integrity of the social order. Every action demanded a counterweight. Still, within the code's precision lies a tenderness of vision. The weak, widows, orphans, the poor are named repeatedly. They were to be protected, not exploited. The river might flood, the sun might scorch, but human society must remain fair. Hammurabi's Babylon was built not on conquest alone, but on the conviction that civilization meant restraint, the mastery not of others but of oneself. The great stele stood in the temple of Marduk for all to see, though few could read its script. His presence mattered more than its comprehension. To gaze upon it was to feel the assurance that even in the shifting sands of power, there was still order, immutable, divine, and enduring. The priests taught that these laws were not static. Each judgment enacted them anew, keeping them alive. In this way, the code became a living instrument of alignment, the harmonization of the mortal realm with that of the gods. The king, the judge, and the scribe were all participants in this sacred music. Night after night, when the moon traced its silver arc above the ziggurat, one could imagine the link between heaven's perfect order and the laws inscribed in stone below. The same geometry that guided the planets also determined the price of grain, the fairness of trade, and the sanctity of a promise. To live justly was to walk in step with the cosmos. Beyond its immediate justice, Hammurabi's law also preserved the spirit of the Anunnaki. Though their names had faded from the living pantheon, their essence, the principle of judgment, the balance between mercy and order, survived in every verdict rendered. The old gods had passed their mantle into human hands. The people of Babylon saw in this transition a sign of divine trust. Humanity, they believed, had matured. The gods still ruled, but through human conscience. The Anunnaki had once sat in their shadowed halls, deciding fates. Now their deliberations echoed in the courts of men. And in that quiet passing of responsibility, something extraordinary occurred, the birth of a human moral consciousness. The lines between myth and governance, between prayer and policy, blurred. To act justly was to worship. To write law was to continue creation. When later empires looked back upon Babylon, they saw not only its towers or its armies, but its wisdom. Assyria, Persia, even Greece, all would inherit fragments of Hammurabi's vision. From these fragments, later ages would build their own laws, their own philosophies of justice. The basalt steel itself would disappear into the soil for more than 3 millennia. It was rediscovered in 1901, buried in the ruins of Susa, far from the city that had once raised it to the sun. Yet the words upon it were as sharp as the day they were carved, the patient endurance of meaning beyond time. To read them now is to hear the same voice that once echoed through Babylon's courtyards, the promise that law, when rooted in truth, outlives the dust of its makers. Perhaps that is the truest legacy of Hammurabi, not the severity of his code, but the serenity of his conviction. That the world, even in its chaos, could be brought into harmony if only men remembered the divine geometry from which it was born. As twilight settled over the city, the king might have stood upon his palace terrace, watching the Euphrates catch the last light of day. He would have known that empires fade, that walls fall, that the stars themselves shift in their slow dance. But he would also have known that order, once spoken into being, endures. For justice, like the heavens, is patient. It waits through ruin and rebirth alike. And as the desert winds whispered beyond Babylon's walls, they carried the same truth that the Anunnaki had once spoken in their silent courts. That balance, though fragile, is eternal. As the centuries turned, the law's stone guardians would watch the city rise and fade. The temples would crumble, the canals would dry, but the idea that humanity could live by a pattern traced in the stars would never truly vanish. Even as Babylon yielded, in time, to the quiet truth of the desert, the dream it carried would drift onward, into new lands, new empires, new tongues, always returning, always renewed. When the last hymn fades, do the gods still listen? The story of Babylon's fall begins not with thunder, but with the soft exhaustion of time. The great city that once believed itself eternal, the meeting place of heaven and earth, the axis of divine order, slowly began to drift toward silence. Its towers still touched the light, but the prayers within them had grown faint. The empire that Hammurabi built endured for centuries through reform and renewal, but no order lasts forever. The floods that once nourished the land began to change their course. Trade shifted along new routes. Distant kings rose in mountain valleys and coastal plains. And within Babylon itself, pride, that ancient seed of unmaking, began to bloom. The priests still tended to Marduk's temple. The New Year festivals continued, though fewer pilgrims came. In the cool darkness of the ziggurat, incense curled upward in thin, uncertain threads. The hymns that had once celebrated divine harmony now carried a tremor of longing, as if even the voices that sang them knew they were echoes of a fading age. In the 8th century before the Common Era, the Assyrians swept down from the north, fierce and efficient, heirs to the same gods who once ruled the southern plains. They did not seek to destroy Babylon outright, not at first. To rule Babylon was to inherit its holiness. And so, kings like Sennacherib and Esarhaddon walked a narrow line, conquerors who dared not offend the city that the gods themselves had blessed. But reverence and rivalry are uneasy companions. The Assyrians built their own capitals, Nineveh, Ashur, cities of stone and steel that mirrored Babylon's grandeur but lacked its grace. They carried the tablets of Marduk's law to their own shrines, recited his myths in their own tongues. In this way, Babylon's spirit survived, even in its subjugation. The conquerors, without intending, became its vessels. And yet, the old order continued to erode. The canals clogged with silt. The temples needed repair. The scholars who once charted the heavens now served foreign courts. The voice of Marduk, once the pulse of the world, began to sound distant, more memory than presence. When Sennacherib, in a moment of fury, ordered Babylon's destruction in 689 BCE, the rivers themselves seemed to mourn. The city was razed, its walls cast into the Euphrates. The idols were carried away or broken. For a time, Babylon ceased to exist, not merely as a city but as an idea. The gods, it seemed, had turned their faces elsewhere. But empires, like rivers, are restless. Esarhaddon, Sennacherib's son, rebuilt the city within a generation. He restored its temples, returned Marduk's statue, and sought forgiveness through stone and ceremony. The Anunnaki, silent witnesses to these cycles of ruin and restoration, seem to remind humankind of an ancient truth, that destruction and creation are not opposites, but reflections. For every ruin holds within it the seed of rebuilding, and every restoration carries within it the shadow of decline. In the centuries that followed, Babylon rose again, not as the unchallenged heart of an empire, but as a jewel among many crowns. Under the Neo-Babylonian dynasty, the city reached one final brilliance. Nebuchadnezzar II, the king who would forever be linked to its name, rebuilt the walls and layers of glazed blue brick and raised the Ishtar Gate, its lions and dragons shining in the desert sun. The ziggurat was rebuilt, the Etemenanki, house of the foundation of heaven and earth, perhaps inspiring later whispers of a tower that sought to reach the sky. To walk through Babylon then would have been to walk through memory itself. Every stone seemed to remember its ancestors. Every temple echoed with the hymns of Sumer. The rivers gleamed with reflections of stories older than language. And yet, even at its height, Babylon carried within it the quiet knowledge of impermanence. The scribes who wrote the chronicles knew that history moved in tides. The stars above, those same constellations their ancestors once traced from Eridu and Ur, spoke of repeating cycles. The gods did not die. They withdrew, waiting for humanity to remember. When the Persians came, led by Cyrus the Great in 539 BCE, they did not take Babylon with fire. The gates opened without resistance. The priests met the conqueror not with swords, but with offerings. In the Cyrus cylinder, that remarkable artifact of empire and mercy, Cyrus declared that Marduk himself had chosen him, that the god of Babylon had guided his armies. In this way, the conqueror became the servant, and the old city was spared another burning. Babylon became part of a larger world, no longer the center, but a cherished fragment of it. The Persians kept its temples alive, its festivals intact. But the pulse of divinity had changed tempo. The gods of the rivers now shared their heavens with distant stars, the gods of Persia, of Greece, of new lands and new dreams. Still, the Anunnaki remained not in temples but in thought. Their names echoed faintly in the writings of scholars, preserved on clay tablets that no longer served ritual but remembrance. The scribes who copied them did so not as acts of worship, but of love. They understood that memory itself is a form of devotion. As centuries turned, Babylon's gardens withered. The canals dried. The once mighty ziggurat became a mound of clay. Travelers in later ages, Greek historians, Persian poets, even Alexander the Great, stood before its ruins and felt the weight of something vast and unknowable. They saw the remains of a city that had once believed it could mirror heaven, and in its silence, they heard the echo of that old ambition. To the Babylonians, the fall of their city was never just political. It was cosmic. When Marduk's temple fell silent, it was as if the rhythm of the universe itself hesitated. The stars continued their course, but the voice that once interpreted them had dimmed. Civilization had entered its long twilight. Yet twilight is not only an ending. It is also the hour of reflection, the soft interval between light and night. In that quiet, the legacy of Babylon took on a new form. Its language, once carved in wet clay, became the foundation for future alphabets. Its laws inspired distant nations. Its myths journeyed westward, taking root in scriptures and stories yet unborn. The Anunnaki, the ancient arbiters of destiny, slipped from history into legend, from legend into metaphor. They became symbols of the unseen order, the whisper of conscience, the memory of balance. Humanity no longer bowed before them, but still felt their shadow in the pattern of justice, in the cycles of death and renewal, in the stories that sought meaning beyond time. When the winds crossed the empty courtyards of Babylon's ruins, they carried not only dust but memory, fragments of songs, the faint imprint of prayers long dissolved. To stand there now is to stand within layers of humanity's oldest dream, that the world, however fragile, is a reflection of something greater. And so the question remains, as it must in every age. When the last hymn fades, do the gods still listen? Perhaps they do. Not from their thrones of stone or heavens of gold, but from the quiet persistence of remembrance itself. For as long as someone speaks their names, the Anunnaki are not gone. They linger, like starlight from a vanished sun, still traveling, still reaching, long after the source has dimmed. And yet, endings in history are only pauses, before memory begins to dream anew. Even in conquest, the old gods ride on stone wings. Long after Sumer's temples had quieted and Babylon's hymns began to fade, the names of the Anunnaki lived on, not in their homeland, but among their conquerors. For history, in its patient way, carries not only bloodlines and empires, but memories. And among the Assyrians, memory became a weapon and a prayer. To the north, along the upper Tigris, the Assyrian cities rose like reflections of an older dream. Ashur, their first and sacred city, gave both its name and its god to the people, a divine echo of Enlil, reshaped in a harder age. As Assyria grew, its kings looked southward, toward the plains that had birthed civilization itself. They did not seek merely to rule, they sought to inherit. The Assyrians built with the conviction of those who remembered their ancestors' greatness but refused to be its shadow. In the towering palaces of Nineveh, Nimrud, and Khorsabad, they carved the stories of creation and divine order once whispered in Sumer. But here they appeared in sharper relief. The Anunnaki were no longer distant arbiters. They had become guardians of empire, winged spirits poised at the thresholds of power. On alabaster walls, one can still trace their forms. Muscular figures with eagle heads, or human faces crowned with feathers, holding pine cones and sacred buckets, gestures of purification. These were not gods in isolation, but intermediaries between heaven and the king. To pass between them was to enter sanctified space, to step beneath the unseen gaze of eternity. The Assyrian kings, Ashurnasirpal, Tiglath-Pileser, Sargon, Sennacherib, ruled with iron will and divine pretense. They believed themselves chosen not merely by gods, but as God's instruments. The Anunnaki became emblems of legitimacy, their images woven into the very language of conquest. Reliefs showed them hovering over battles, their wings outstretched above the marching armies. In this vision, divinity was not distant or abstract. It was immediate, embodied, and fierce. And yet, beneath the authority and discipline of empire, A quieter truth endured, that these symbols, fierce though they seemed, were born of older tenderness. Their roots lay in myths of balance and cosmic justice, not dominance. To the Assyrian craftsman, chiseling each feather, the act itself may have been a prayer. A way to remember what power must protect, not only what it commands. In this sense, the Anunnaki's journey into Assyria was not a distortion but a continuation, a translation of belief into the language of empire. Where once they had judged humanity, they now watched over it in stone. As the Assyrian armies expanded westward into Anatolia, the Levant, and even the shadowed lands of Egypt, so too did the Anunnaki travel, not as names but as forms and ideas. The winged figures guarding temple doors in distant lands carried within them the memory of Sumer sky gods. The motif of the celestial guardian, half man and half divine, began to appear far beyond Mesopotamia, a visual inheritance older than writing itself. In these carvings, the calm rhythm of continuity unfolds. Civilizations rose, fell, and blended, yet the essence persisted. The belief that heaven and earth, though separate, mirror each other, and that humanity's role is to maintain that fragile reflection. Within Assyria's heartlands, however, power began to turn inward. The empire's scale demanded cruelty and precision. Its monuments grew taller, even as its soil grew weary. The capital cities, glittering with imported cedar and bronze, became vaults of memory as much as of treasure. Scholars continued to copy tablets, flood myths, omens, lists of gods, their cuneiform signs preserving what time itself seemed ready to forget. In their script, the old names survived: Anu, Enlil, Ea, Ishtar, Ninurta. To later generations, they would become more distant, their genealogies tangled, their myths transformed. Yet the thread remained unbroken. Each copied tablet was an act of resistance against oblivion, a whisper across centuries. When Assyria fell in 612 BCE, its cities burned, its palaces shattered, its kings gone silent, the reliefs of the winged spirits remained. Amid the ashes of Nineveh, the Anunnaki still stood watch, expressionless and eternal. The empire that had borrowed their strength could not protect itself, but its art endured, carrying forward the shape of its faith. Through time's slow alchemy, the imagery of these beings would wander even further. In Persia, the Ahura Mazda reliefs, the winged discs above royal figures, echo that same Mesopotamian inheritance. In Greece, distant echoes of the sky gods would merge with Olympian visions. Even in later angelic iconography, the winged guardians of monotheistic traditions, the faint outline of the Anunnaki may still be glimpsed, softened by centuries but never erased. And so, the story that began in Sumer did not vanish in conquest. It evolved, adapting to each new world that remembered it. The Anunnaki became less like deities and more like archetypes, embodiments of order, guidance, and the unseen harmony between power and duty. In the museum halls of our present age, the Assyrian guardians still stand. Visitors walk quietly beneath their wings, their massive forms towering over polished floors. The stone is pale, but the presence is immense. They no longer command devotion, yet they evoke it, not the devotion of faith but of awe. Each line carved 3,000 years ago still holds intention. The belief that humanity's creations could bridge the mortal and the eternal. As one stands before these statues, it is easy to feel what their makers must have felt, that sense of participating in something vast and cyclical. The same dust that once clung to the feet of Sumerian priests may now rest upon the shoes of modern travelers. The continuity is almost sacred in its silence. Even as the names changed, from Anunnaki to Apkallu, from Apkallu to angels, from gods to symbols, the essence remained: guardianship, wisdom, and the eternal longing to protect what is fragile in humankind. For the Assyrians, that fragility was their empire, immense yet precarious. For us, it may be memory itself. As centuries folded over centuries, the old cities became ruins beneath newer ruins. The Tigris still flowed, though its banks had changed. Shepherds and traders passed where kings once stood. Yet beneath their feet, the tablets slept, preserved in the embrace of clay, waiting for rediscovery. And when archaeologists unearthed them in the modern age, when the light of electric lamps touched the same script that once recorded divine decrees, it was as if the Anunnaki themselves stirred once more, not to command, but to remind, that even when civilizations fall, meaning does not. Travels in language, in art, in memory. And so, the ancient names endured until they became whispers beneath new tongues. What do we awaken when we unearth the dreams of the first dreamers? For millennia, the story of Sumer, and the gods who once walked beside its rivers, lay buried beneath the quiet dust of time. Cities that had once shone with divine order became fields of broken brick. The names of kings and gods, carved in the intricate strokes of cuneiform, faded from human memory. To later ages, Babylon was legend. Before it, Sumer was silence. Yet the earth remembers what the mind forgets. And in the 19th century, the silence began to stir. European explorers, archaeologists, and wanderers, following rumors of lost cities mentioned in scripture and myth, journeyed into the deserts of southern Mesopotamia. They found, half buried in sand and salt, the ruins of places once thought eternal. Ur, Lagash, Nippur, Eridu. At first, what they uncovered seemed mute. Layers of clay, scattered bricks, fragments of walls that hinted at ancient grandeur. But then came the tablets. Tens of thousands of small, hardened pieces of clay, covered with wedge-shaped marks. To the untrained eye, they appeared like meaningless impressions. Yet to those who studied them, these marks would prove to be the oldest written language ever known. Under dim lamps and patient hands, scholars began the long work of decipherment. Each sign, each repeated pattern, was a step toward resurrecting a forgotten voice. And when meaning finally emerged, the effect was almost spiritual. The tablets spoke of kings and floods, of trade and taxes, of songs to gods who had once ruled the heavens. The world realized, with quiet awe, that it was hearing the thoughts of the first civilization. It was as if humanity had found an ancient mirror, and within it, saw its own beginnings reflected back. The cities named in the tablets were real. The Sumerians, once a whisper of myth, were real. And so were the Anunnaki, the great gods, the council of the divine, whose names had traveled through time disguised as echoes in later stories. They were not angels nor devils, but something older. The personifications of order and destiny, the spiritual architecture of the cosmos itself. To read their names again, Anu, Enlil, Enki, Inanna, Ninhursag, was to reopen a forgotten chapter of the human imagination. The archaeologists, kneeling in the dust, could not have known that they were awakening more than a civilization. They were reviving the oldest dialogue between humankind and meaning, the eternal question of what it means to create, to govern, to worship, to endure. In Ur, they found ziggurats that once reached toward the heavens, their bricks inscribed with prayers. In Nippur, they uncovered the archives of priests, records of offerings, omens, and hymns to Enlil, the lord of the air. And in Eridu, perhaps the oldest of all cities, they found traces of temples built atop older temples, 17 layers deep, each generation rebuilding upon the sacred foundation of the last. It was a physical manifestation of memory itself. The discovery of Sumer reshaped history. What had been myth now had context. What had been speculation became evidence. The Bible's stories of the flood and Babel found their ancient roots in the clay of Mesopotamia. And with that realization came a humbling awareness. The lineage of civilization was older and broader than once believed. The Anunnaki, once worshipped as gods, now appeared in the light of archaeology as symbols of a timeless human impulse, the need to order chaos, to find purpose in the vastness of existence. Their myths spoke not only of divine power, but of human striving, of creation born from the abyss, of law born from conflict, of compassion emerging from wisdom. To the calm listener, this rediscovery offers more than curiosity. It is a reunion between the modern mind and its oldest memories. The tools may have changed, but the yearning remains the same. To understand where we come from, and what sacred truths lie buried in our beginnings. In museums across the world, those clay tablets now rest behind glass, yet they retain a living presence. Their wedge-shaped script, delicate, precise, rhythmic, feels less like writing than breathing. Each line is a pulse from another age. Visitors lean close, drawn not by spectacle, but by the quiet intimacy of communication across 5,000 years. And for scholars who read them, the experience borders on reverence. To trace the story of the flood, written centuries before the tale of Noah, is to glimpse how ideas evolve, how truth changes shape but not essence. To read a Sumerian hymn to Inanna is to hear the first music of devotion. To study the legal codes of Ur and Nippur is to see the first attempt at justice written into stone. Every fragment tells a story of continuity, of humanity seeking meaning in a world that often resists it. The rediscovery of Sumer did not merely fill a historical gap. It reshaped our sense of time. It reminded the world that civilization is not a sudden flame, but a long, patient dawn. One that began beside two rivers under stars that still shine today. And perhaps, as the archaeologists brushed the dust from the faces of statues and the surfaces of tablets, something older stirred, not in the soil, but in the collective heart of humankind. A recognition that the ancient and the modern are bound not by blood, but by thought. That the same impulse that built the first temple also drives the scientist, the artist, the dreamer. The Anunnaki returned, not as deities demanding worship, but as metaphors for the enduring human quest, the search for knowledge, harmony, and transcendence. And so, in quiet laboratories and library vaults, under fluorescent light instead of torch flame, the gods of clay spoke again. Their voices, soft but persistent, reminded us that history is never truly gone. It waits, patient beneath our feet, until we are ready to listen. As the 20th century dawned, their stories would inspire a new generation of seekers, historians, poets, and philosophers, each asking the same ancient question in a new tongue. Who were the Anunnaki, truly? The question that once filled temples now filled classrooms and journals. And the answers, though many, all pointed toward the same truth, that the divine, whatever form it takes, is a mirror of the human spirit. The rediscovery of Sumer was not the revival of gods. It was the rediscovery of ourselves. And as scholars brushed dust from ancient words, a deeper reflection began to emerge, that perhaps the Anunnaki had never vanished at all, but had simply changed their dwelling, from stone to story, from temple to mind. When we gaze into ancient myths, do we seek the gods or simply our own reflection? In the centuries following the rediscovery of Sumer, the story of the Anunnaki began to travel once more. This time not on clay tablets or through temple hymns, but through books, lectures, and glowing screens. What had once been the sacred language of priests and kings became the subject of scholars, poets, and eventually, storytellers who wove the old names into new patterns. The academic world approached the Anunnaki with the patience of archaeology. Linguists translated their hymns and legal codes, tracing the evolution of belief from Sumer to Babylon, from Babylon to Assyria, from myth to scripture. To the historian, the Anunnaki represented the first coherent system of divine order, an early human attempt to understand the relationship between earth and sky, fate and freedom, power and responsibility. In their world, the divine was not distant. The gods walked among humanity, not as unreachable spirits, but as presences intertwined with daily life, in the floods that gave and took away, in the harvest, in the laws that governed cities. To study them, then, was to study the origins of thought itself. But as their story entered the modern age, something curious happened. The same mystery that once inspired reverence now awakened imagination. The Anunnaki, whose names had been silent for thousands of years, began to appear in new forms, in speculative writings, in science fiction, in the borderlands between curiosity and conjecture. It began innocently enough. The rediscovery of a forgotten pantheon stirred wonder. But soon, wonder became interpretation, and interpretation became reinvention. Writers, seeking to connect the ancient with the cosmic, reimagined the Anunnaki as celestial visitors, beings from beyond the stars who brought knowledge to humankind. This modern mythology, though far removed from archaeology, reflected a deep and enduring desire to see the ancient world not as distant, but as part of an ongoing mystery. There is something profoundly human in this impulse. Every age, it seems, seeks to make the old stories its own. The Greeks turned Sumer's flood into the tale of Deucalion. The Hebrews transformed it into the story of Noah. And modern thinkers, standing beneath satellites instead of stars, reinterpreted it as contact from the heavens. Yet the truth beneath these myths is neither diminished nor displaced. The Sumerians never spoke of visitors from other worlds. Their heavens were spiritual, not stellar. Their gods, symbolic, not extraterrestrial. The Anunnaki were the embodiment of the forces that shape life: fertility, wisdom, justice, storm, and sky. They represented the structure of existence itself, not its interruption. Still, the persistence of fascination tells its own story. For beneath the speculative theories and modern retellings lies a deeper yearning, the same that first led the Sumerians to carve their questions into clay. It is the yearning to know whether humanity stands alone in the vastness of creation, and whether the wisdom we possess is our own, or a gift inherited from something greater. This question has followed civilization like a shadow, changes shape, but never disappears. And perhaps that is why the Anunnaki endure. They exist at the meeting point of knowledge and wonder. In universities, they are studied as the earliest expressions of theology and cosmology, evidence of how humanity first mapped the invisible. In popular imagination, they have become symbols of ancient wisdom, guardians of lost knowledge. And somewhere between those two visions lies a quiet truth: that myth, in its deepest form, is not about literal belief, but about meaning. To speak of the Anunnaki is to speak of origins, not only of civilization but of curiosity. For they were born from humanity's first questions. Who made the world? Why do the rivers flood? What lies beyond the horizon? And though our tools have changed, those questions remain the same. The modern fascination with these ancient beings also reveals something else: our struggle to balance wonder with reason. In a world defined by technology and information, myths like those of the Anunnaki remind us of mystery's quiet necessity. They ask us not to believe blindly, but to imagine deeply. To stand before the ruins of Ur or the tablets of Nippur is to feel a stillness that transcends centuries. There, in the faint marks of cuneiform, we meet our ancestors not as strangers, but as fellow seekers. Their gods were born from observation and awe, from watching the stars and the rivers, from sensing that behind nature's rhythm lay a consciousness too vast to name. And perhaps that is the bridge between myth and science. Both are ways of looking at the unknown with reverence. Modern retellings, from novels and films to documentaries and speculative theories, often reshape the Anunnaki into vessels for contemporary hope or fear. Yet even these distortions reveal something essential: that the past continues to speak, and we continue to listen. The challenge, then, is not to silence imagination, but to guide it, to let wonder coexist with truth. For the true magic of the Anunnaki is not in what they might have been, but in what they represent: humanity's awakening to thought, art, and the sacred geometry of existence. When scholars read their myths today, they find poetry woven through the fabric of governance and ritual. The Sumerians described creation not as a singular miracle, but as a collaboration between forces, heaven and earth joining to bring forth life. It is a vision of balance, not dominance, of harmony, not hierarchy. Such visions remain as relevant now as they were 5,000 years ago. In an age of constant noise, the calm precision of their stories invites us to listen again, to see the world not as separate parts, but as an unfolding whole. And so, when modern readers encounter the Anunnaki, whether in the quiet of a museum or the glow of a screen, they are not meeting aliens or lost gods, but reflections of their own search for meaning. The same rivers that once nourished Sumer flow still, beneath different skies, carrying the same questions downstream. To misunderstand the Anunnaki is easy. To truly hear them requires stillness, a willingness to see beyond literalism and into metaphor. Their power lies not in their mystery, but in what that mystery mirrors within us. The Anunnaki are not lost. They live wherever curiosity endures. And thus, beneath centuries of retelling, their true legacy emerges, not in power, but in wonder. For even when myth changes its shape, its purpose remains: to remind humanity that it was never meant to forget how to dream. Perhaps every civilization is but a memory dreaming itself awake. When the first cities rose from the mud of the Tigris and Euphrates, humanity began a dream that has never ended. Walls of clay became towers, rivers became trade routes, language became scripture, and beneath every invention, the same pulse echoed: the desire to remember and to be remembered. The story of the Anunnaki began in that light half-dawn, half-dusk, where myth was not yet separate from truth. The gods of Sumer were not abstractions, but presences woven into wind and rain, birth and harvest. To name them was to name the patterns that sustained existence. Yet as the centuries passed, the dream grew more intricate. The Sumerians gave way to Akkadians, the Akkadians to Babylonians, the Babylonians to Assyrians, each inheriting and reshaping what came before. Empires rose like waves and broke upon the same shores of time, leaving fragments behind. A seal, a prayer, a song to the gods who shaped both destiny and dust. If we listen closely, those fragments still whisper. They tell of a people who saw the world not as a collection of moments, but as a living story, an unbroken thread between heaven and earth. The Anunnaki were the keepers of that thread, binding creation to consciousness. And though their temples have fallen, their story continues, not in stone, but in thought. For every act of remembrance, every search for meaning, is a quiet echo of the same impulse that once carved myths into clay. Perhaps civilization itself is a form of worship, not of gods but of continuity. Each generation, like a scribe, adds its line to the great tablet of existence. The tools change, but the gesture remains: to understand, to build, to preserve. In the soft light of reflection, we see that humanity has never truly stopped conversing with its origins. We look to the stars as the Sumerians once did, mapping them not with reeds and clay, but with glass and silicon. Yet the question is unchanged: where did we come from? And why are we here? The Anunnaki once answered those questions through myth. Modern minds answer them through science. But both speak to the same yearning, a need to place ourselves within something larger, something that endures beyond the span of a single life. And so the dream continues. From ziggurats to satellites, from hymns to data, from the first spark of writing to the quiet glow of a screen in the dark, the story of civilization is the story of memory itself. It is said that when the gods first shaped humanity, they did so from clay and breath, matter and meaning combined. And perhaps that is still true. For every civilization begins in the same way, with an act of imagination, a shaping of the formless into something that can be shared. The Anunnaki may no longer be worshipped, but they are remembered. In every myth retold, in every scholar's translation, in every listener who closes their eyes to the sound of their story, they live on not as deities, but as symbols of continuity. Their temples have become ruins, but their spirit has become language. Their rituals have faded, but their questions have not. And in that endurance lies their divinity. To reflect upon them is to look inward. The gods they created may have been reflections of forces beyond comprehension, but also of humanity itself, its creativity, its fear, its longing for permanence. For what is a god, if not the embodiment of what a civilization most values? The Sumerians sought order in chaos, justice in power, fertility in the uncertain rhythm of seasons. Through their myths they gave form to the unseen. Through their cities they gave structure to the infinite. And through their remembrance, they began the first chapters of what we now call history. Every civilization that followed, Egypt, Greece, Rome, and all those beyond, carried something of that original spark. The awareness that life, fragile and fleeting, could be made meaningful through story. That the world, vast and unpredictable, could be understood through symbol. And so, Across millennia, humanity has continued the work of the first dreamers. We build not only to survive, but to remember. Not only to live, but to be known. Perhaps this is what binds all eras together, the quiet belief that creation itself is an act of faith. To build a city, to write a word, to whisper a name into the dark. All are ways of saying, we were here. Tonight, as the stars burn with the same light that once guided shepherds along Mesopotamian plains, the dream feels unbroken. Beneath these constellations, older than any nation or name, humanity still reaches outward and inward, seeking the divine pattern within itself. The rivers of Sumer have changed their courses, but their reflection remains. The same moon that once shone upon Ur now glows on screens, on skylines, on the faces of those who still wonder. Civilization has stretched across the globe, yet its heart remains the same. The need to connect, to create, to find meaning in the endless tide of time. The Anunnaki, once guardians of the heavens, have become guardians of memory, not because they rule, but because we remember. And in remembering, we keep alive the spark that first lit the human story. Perhaps that is the true purpose of myth, not to explain the world, but to remind us to marvel at it. For wonder is the root of every beginning. And so, from clay to code, from prayer to poetry, from ziggurat to satellite, the dream of civilization endures, patient, luminous, eternal. And beneath the endless sky, history becomes a lullaby. Beneath these stars, older than any name, humanity still dreams. The night is vast and endless, the same sky that stretched above Sumer now folding softly over us. The constellations shimmer like ancient scripts, each star a forgotten syllable in the great poem of existence. Once, priests and kings stood beneath this same celestial canopy, seeking meaning in its scattered lights. Now we look upward not with fear or supplication, but with the quiet awe of recognition, knowing that the universe which gave birth to the gods also gave birth to us. The story of the Anunnaki began with creation, the mingling of water and earth, the shaping of order from chaos. It carried through the rise of cities, the songs of temples, the wars of empires, and the whispers of memory. Now, at the end of that long arc, what remains is not the sound of conquest or the weight of stone, but something softer. The knowledge that the human need to dream, to explain, to belong, is as eternal as the stars themselves. Perhaps this is what the ancients truly understood, that myth and history are not rivals, but reflections, two ways of touching the infinite. Through their stories, the Sumerians sought not escape from reality, but a deeper intimacy with it. To name the gods was to name the mysteries that gave life its shape. To offer worship was to acknowledge the fragile beauty of existence. In their reverence, they left us a gift, not the certainty of divine truth, but the wonder of asking. Each tablet uncovered, each seal pressed into clay, is a voice carried across the silence of millennia. It says softly, we were here, we wondered too. And so, as we drift at the edge of sleep, the Anunnaki linger, not as rulers or watchers, but as echoes of the first human imagination. Their temples have turned to dust, yet their symbols still live in our thoughts, in our myths, in the stories we tell to understand our place in the cosmos. The stars above once marked the paths of gods. Now they map the paths of galaxies. The rivers of Mesopotamia have changed their courses, but they still flow in our collective memory. The clay tablets have cracked, yet their words continue to speak, carried through time by those who listen. The Anunnaki's world has ended 1,000 times, yet it endures because we remember, not as worshippers but as witnesses, not in faith but in gratitude. For through their myths we glimpse our own beginnings, our first questions, our first hopes, our first attempts to turn chaos into meaning. Perhaps, in the end, that is all civilization ever seeks. A gentle balance between what can be known and what must simply be felt. Between the measured rhythm of time and the stillness that lies beyond it. The same moon that once glowed over Ur still rises, unchanged. The same wind that once moved through the reeds of the Euphrates still crosses fields and oceans. And somewhere, deep in the quiet of night, The same longing hums within the human heart. To reach beyond, to name, to dream. Listen, and you can almost hear it. The soft murmur of creation itself. The echo of voices that built the first temples. The rhythm of chisels on stone. The faint song of hymns to unseen gods. They fade, yet they never vanish completely. They live on in every act of remembrance, in every gaze toward the stars. The story of the Anunnaki does not end in myth or ruin. Continues each time someone wonders how it all began. Each time a hand brushes the earth and feels its ancient pulse. Each time a listener closes their eyes to the quiet music of the past. For the Anunnaki are not gone. They have simply become part of the pattern. The pattern of stars, of time, of thought. And in that pattern, the story of civilization sleeps, not finished but dreaming. So rest now. Let the weight of history settle like dust in the dark. Let the rivers run again through your imagination, broad and slow, carrying whispers of the first dawn. Let the stars above, eternal and watching, remind you that you too are part of this endless story. And as the night deepens, remember, the same light that once touched the temples of Sumer now touches your world. The same dream flows on, unbroken, a current of wonder stretching from the first breath of humanity to this quiet moment now. And so ends the story of the Anunnaki, not with belief but with quiet wonder.